On Thursday, April 17, 2019, at 4:35 p.m., inside the USC General Justice Building at Joint Base Grissom, I finished my coffee and checked my watch. The day had dragged on, and I was eager for it to end. After 3 hours of testifying and answering questions, I found myself in a cramped room with just a TV and my thoughts for company. I'd been waiting for over 2 hours since then, wondering when the board would reach a decision. The door swung open, and Commander Tom Baker, my legal rep, stepped in. "The counsel's done for the day, Lieutenant Jones," he informed me. "That's me, William Jones, or Bill, to friends and family. I'm a senior flight lieutenant in the United States Space Corps, formerly the Space Force, established nearly 80 years ago. They want you back at 8 o'clock tomorrow, so head back to your quarters," Commander Baker instructed. "And remember, avoid chatting with other witnesses, especially your wife." "You mean my soon-to-be ex-wife, the cheating one?" I clarified. He nodded. "Exactly," he affirmed. "Now, Lieutenant, get going and steer clear of trouble." "Aye, sir," I replied, rising. I stretched, grabbed my case, and left. I drove my compact electric car back to the BOQ, where I changed clothes, microwaved a faux meat burger, and grabbed a beer. After a quick meal, I settled into my chair, turned on the TV for news, but found nothing interesting. So I reclined, reflecting on recent weeks. Until recently, I served as the weapons officer on the USS Armstrong, a top spacecraft named after a moon landing astronaut. It seated 110 crew and boasted formidable firepower: nuclear missiles, energy weapons, railguns, and mini lasers. The Armstrong's maiden voyage to Jupiter was special because my wife, Tabitha, was also on board as the chief pilot. We were high school sweethearts who pledged exclusivity and shared dreams of space exploration. Despite being stationed at the same base, our missions often separated us. While she was away, I delved into GravTac, a martial art suited for low-gravity environments, honing my skills in strength and tactical prowess. I never once doubted Tabby's loyalty. My trust in her was unwavering, never even entertaining the idea of her being unfaithful. Despite occasional temptations, I remained dedicated to our relationship, never envisioning any betrayal. We often fantasized about experiencing closeness in zero gravity on the Moon or Mars. When we both received orders for the Armstrong, it felt like our dreams were coming true. However, what began as a dream turned into an agonizing nightmare. I vividly recall the day of my departure. Friday, January 3rd, 2019, at Canaveral Launch Complex, Florida. Clad in my suit and lost in thought, I boarded the passenger shuttle headed for the Armstrong's orbital dock, accompanied by 20 others. Tabby, serving as the chief pilot, had departed hours earlier on the first shuttle. I followed on the third, with 3 more shuttles set to follow. Seated beside me was Commander Jason Travers, known as Bull for his size and demeanor. I remembered him from our academy days. He had been Tabby's counselor and a strict instructor. Despite knowing him, our interactions were minimal, limited to a few classes. "Excited to serve with your wife, Jones?" asked Bull. "Yes, sir, I am," I replied. "This will make history," he remarked. "Heading farther than ever," I informed him. "Jupiter and back in under 100 days. Quite the mission." As the pumps hummed beneath us, signaling our imminent departure from Earth, Bull ensured everyone was ready. "Time to bid Earth goodbye." "That's it, let it go," he grumbled before reclining. With visors down, we braced for liftoff. The rocket's rumble and the pull of gravity intensified. Through the window, clouds rushed past as we ascended, the sky darkening to reveal the planet's curvature below. The shuttle shuddered as boosters detached, destined for reuse near our launch site. After an hour, I spotted a distant structure. "There she is," Bull announced, lifting his visor. "Docking soon." 30 minutes later, the shuttle approached the open dock, matching its speed. 2 tubular structures extended, connecting with a hiss as pressure stabilized. "There we go," Bull said. "Prepare for some gravity. Ship's at 0.8 G. Knowing the Armstrong's gravity system could be adjusted, I anticipated relief from weightlessness effects like fluid shifts and muscle atrophy. As the crew signaled, a green light flashed over the hatches. Bull stood, signaling others to follow. I unfastened, grabbed my bag, adjusting to the ship's reduced gravity from the shuttle's near-zero gravity. Within steps, I felt the weight of my gear. 4 hours to station launch, folks," Bull announced upon our ship entry. "Let's hustle. 3 more shuttles are right behind us." Knowing our cabin's location, I headed there, hopeful to find Tabby. Though she wasn't present, her belongings filled half the closet, indicating she'd arrived. After stowing my gear and shedding the spacesuit for my flight suit, I grabbed my uniform cap and headed to the bridge, ready to man the weapons console. The bridge buzzed with activity as I ran calibration routines and checked weapon inventories. Ensuring cruise missile platforms and weapon stations were secure, I prepared a report for Captain Alan Simmons, whom I recognized from our time on the Shepherd. Upon the medic's departure, I submitted my inventory, acknowledging our past service together. He signed the inventory, and we verified our key codes. Only 3 people held keys to the cruise missiles: the captain, the first officer, and me. 2 keys were required to launch. "Good to have you with us, Jones," Captain Simmons said. "I hear you're married to our chief pilot." Tabby smiled at this. "Yes, sir," I replied. "Great," Alan said. "Should make the trip more interesting for you." "Yes, sir, I hope so," I said, glancing at Tabby, who smiled mischievously before returning to her tasks. Bull arrived on the bridge, inspecting everything. His icy stare signaled it was time for me to return to my post. "Better get back to my station, sir." Alan nodded and moved on. I returned to my station, confirming all calibration tasks were complete. Everything was in perfect order. Knowing Captain Simmons' penchant for impromptu weapons drills from our time on the Shepherd, I ensured weapons were always ready and the targeting system was calibrated. Each shift started with a calibration check to maintain system accuracy unless a malfunction occurred. Finally, Alan began the pre-launch check while we strapped in. "Operative," he called. "All systems ready for launch," replied Lieutenant Sam. "Engineering," Alan continued. "All systems normal. Proceed to launch," said Chief Engineer Lieutenant Sam. "Weapons?" "All systems calibrated and weapons accounted for," I confirmed. "Comms?" "Communications 5x5, sir," said Lieutenant Denise Simpson. "Navigation?" "Course plotted and locked. ETA at Mars Station is 440 hours," reported Lieutenant Ryan Halcomb. "Number 1? All personnel in place and ready for launch," Bull reported. Alan nodded and pressed a console button. "Houston, this is Armstrong, requesting permission to launch." "Launch authorization granted, Armstrong. Godspeed," came the response. "Roger that, Houston," Alan replied, then instructed. "Spaddock, this is Armstrong. Retract all lines." "Copy that, Armstrong. Lines retracting," came the reply, followed by sharp sounds as the lines retracted. Moments later, we received confirmation that all lines were retracted. "Start the engines," Alan ordered. "Engines running," Brian confirmed. "Take us out, helmsman. Nice and easy. Don't scratch the paint," Alan said with a smile. "Aye, sir," Tabby responded, pulling 2 levers and holding the control column. The ship moved forward slowly, nearing the spaceport exit. We relied on maneuvering thrusters, as firing the ion fusion plasma thrusters inside the dock would damage both it and the Armstrong. Soon, we were clear of the structure. "The space dock is ready," Tabby said. "We'll spiral out of Earth orbit to a point between Earth and the Moon, then fire the big engines. That's the Q spot," she explained. I could see the tracking on the navigator's console. An hour later, the navigator announced, "ETA to Q point is 2 microns, sir. The road is clear." This meant no debris or rocks were detected ahead. "Copy that," Alan said. "Engineering?" "Engines warmed up and ready, sir," Brian confirmed. Alan informed Houston, "Armstrong approaching point Q." "Approaching Q point. Copy that, Armstrong," came the response. We watched the countdown timers, preparing for the launch. At 0 o'clock, Alan said, "Pump up the tires and light a fire, helmsman. Let's see what this girl can do." Tabby's hands moved over the console. "Kicking tires, starting fires." "Aye, sir," she replied, sliding the control levers forward. As the engines roared to life, the force of acceleration gripped us, the hum intensifying with each surge of G-force. We soared at speeds surpassing any human's experience. Casting a glance at Tabby, I beamed with pride. Offering a smile, a wink, and a thumbs up. Returning the smile, she glanced at Bull. Sensing Bull's tension, I redirected my focus to my console. An hour later, a foreboding feeling crept in. Bull's posting of the officer's schedule on the bridge didn't surprise me, but seeing myself assigned to the second shift did. In space, time follows Houston's schedule, with dimming lights simulating nighttime during the second shift. While it's not a formal rule, typically, senior officers take the first shift. Seeing Bull place me on the second shift felt like a demotion, indicating limited time for Tabby and me to be together since she'd be on the first shift. If fortunate, we might catch a glimpse of each other during shift changes. To say I was pissed off was an understatement, and Bull knew it. "Is there a scheduling problem, Lieutenant?" he asked. I looked up to see him in front of my console. Alice had also walked over, having seen the schedule and curious about his explanation. "Am I still the senior weapons officer, sir?" I asked. "Yes, of course," Bull replied. "Then why am I working the second shift?" "In my opinion, it's the best place for you. he said, drawing attention. If you have a scheduling problem, discuss it with the captain through me. By this time, Alan had approached. Is there a problem, gentlemen? He asked. Lieutenant Jones doesn't like the bridge schedule, sir, Bull said. Alan frowned at the schedule. I understand his feelings, number one, he said. It's very unusual, don't you agree? Yes, sir. Normally I would, Bull said. But I believe Lieutenant Jones's knowledge and experience are best utilized on the second shift. It also gives us a chance to train other gunnery officers on the first shift. My crap detectors went off. I couldn't believe the crap he was feeding the captain. Is that the only reason, Commander, or is there more? Alan asked, clearly skeptical. If I may speak freely, sir, Bull said quietly. Always number one, Alan replied. I've never liked spouses working on the same ship, especially in close quarters. I don't want them distracted from their duties. That's what I thought, Alan said. I understand, but I won't let this affect their morale. Make sure they spend time together. Understood? Yes, sir, Bull said. Alan looked at me. Can you do that, Lieutenant? Yes, sir, I replied. Good, carry on, Alan said, walking away. Bull smirked at me. Don't worry, Jones. I'll keep an eye on your wife, he said before leaving. I turned to Alice, who put a finger to her lips. Don't say anything, Bill, she said. We'll talk later. I'll call Lieutenant Robinson. Yes, ma'am, I said quietly. I glanced at Tabby, who was focused on her console, her face flushed. I couldn't tell if it was from embarrassment or guilt. I left the bridge feeling more humiliated than ever. Something was definitely off. I headed to the galley, hoping to grab something to eat. It wasn't a usual meal time, so I knew the selection would be limited. Not much available right now, Lieutenant, said the man behind the plexiglass partition. We have hamburgers made of artificial meat. They taste terrible, but they'll fill you up. That'll do, I said. He handed me one on a tray and offered a packet of flavored ketchup. Want some axle grease to make it better? He asked with a smile. Sure, why not? I said, taking the packet. Thanks. Anytime, Lieutenant, he replied. I grabbed a small bottle of chocolate milk and found a vacant table. I ate the burger, drenched it in ketchup, and downed the milk. The burger tasted awful, but it filled me up, and the ketchup helped a bit. I put the tray away, tossed the trash, and headed back to my quarters. I lay down, trying to sleep, but couldn't stop thinking about Bull. What did he mean about looking after Tabby? After an hour of tossing and turning, I gave up. Frustrated, I put on my workout clothes and headed to the small gym on one of the lower decks. When I arrived, I was relieved to find the gym empty. Good, I thought. I could vent my frustration without anyone around. I stretched, worked out on the treadmill and weight machine, then adjusted the gravity to 0.4 G. Feeling lighter, I practiced some GravTac techniques for half an hour. By then, I was sweaty and ready to sleep. I reset the gravity, returned to my quarters, showered in the tiny bathroom, set my alarm, and fell asleep instantly. When the alarm went off, I got up, showered, shaved, dressed, and headed to the galley for a snack. It was much better than the faux meat burger I had earlier. I arrived at the bridge just as Tabby was leaving. Hello, stranger, I said. She looked at me and smiled. Hi, she said. I didn't get a chance to tell you, but you did a great job with the launch, I said. Thank you, she replied. Maybe I'll come by during my lunch break and we can spend some time together, I suggested. I could see her thinking it over, expecting her to make an excuse. Thankfully, she didn't. Sure, I'll set the alarm, she said. Maybe you can eat me instead of one of those fake burgers. Works for me, I said. I'll see you in 6 hours. I'll be there, she said, giving me a quick kiss. I love you too, I replied. I watched her walk away, hopeful we could make it work. Then I turned and saw Bull grinning. About damn time you showed up, Jones, he said. I checked my watch. My shift doesn't start for another 15 minutes, Commander, I said. I just wanted to talk to my wife before duty, if that's okay with you, sir. I thought he might lash out, but he calmed down. Yeah, all right, he said, and walked down the corridor. I went onto the bridge and took over for Lieutenant Robinson, who handed me my shift and walked out. As I started the calibration, Alice approached me. How are you holding up? She asked. I'll be fine, Alice, I said. Seriously, how are you doing? She pressed. It's not easy, but I can handle it. Thanks for asking. You're welcome. Listen, I know you have a lot on your mind, but I think you need to keep an eye on your wife and Commander Travers, she said. I looked at her, shocked. Do you think there's something going on between them? Maybe. Call it female intuition, but I've seen little glances between them. Nothing obvious, but there's definitely a spark, she explained. Got it, Alice. Thanks for the heads up. I plan to meet with her on my lunch break. Hope that helps.
I hope so too, Bill,
she said. Should we tell the captain? I asked. She shook her head. Not unless you have solid evidence. Accusing a senior officer without proof can backfire and hurt your career. Just stay alert and keep your wife alert. I'll watch during the first shift. Okay, Alice, thanks. She nodded and left the bridge. I checked the calibration and inspected the cruise missiles and weapons stations. When I returned, Alan was waiting. Interested in target practice? He asked. Sure thing, I agreed. All right, launch some drones, he instructed. I set up 5 drones and activated the mini lasers, akin to old miniguns but with intense heat. The lasers swiftly destroyed the drones. Well done, Lieutenant, Alan praised. Thanks, sir, I replied. He suggested I'd take the center chair as the senior officer on watch while he rested. Yes, sir, thank you, I acknowledged, knowing his knack for power naps from past experience. He left the bridge, and I took over his spot. Sitting in the commander's chair, I felt in control, overseeing the ship's activities. Each crew member wore a wrist device, serving multiple functions like timekeeping, communication, tracking, and vital sign monitoring, except during showers. Using the tracking monitor, I located Travers in his quarters, confirmed by his steady pulse indicating he wore the device. Checking for Jones, I found 2 Williams, myself, and Tabitha. Choosing Tabitha, I observed her beacon in our quarters, mirroring Travers' status, asleep with normal vitals. Though tempted to review their tracker history, lacking necessary credentials prevented me. Convinced of their engagement, I deactivated the tracking monitor and focused on other tasks. Looking around the busy bridge, it seemed my presence went unnoticed as everyone attended to their duties. Returning to my console, I double-checked the checklist, finding everything operating as expected. A scheduled course adjustment loomed about an hour ahead, already programmed into the navigation system. The communications officer remained in touch with Houston's flight control, sparing my involvement unless immediate captain intervention was needed. The engineer on duty monitored engine and vital system conditions. The helmsman and navigator ensured smooth ship flight, especially for the impending course correction. After logging the hour's activities, I briefly inspected the weapons console before returning to the central chair. About 2 hours into the shift, Petty Officer Marks took drink orders from everyone, allowing beverages with covers and straws at our stations. After a brief absence, she returned with drinks for all. Shortly before my lunch break, Alan resumed his seat, where I briefed him on the shift's progress. He acknowledged, making notes in his journal. "Thank you, Lieutenant," he said, gesturing for me to take my break with a subtle wink. "Yes, sir," I replied, stepping away from my post. Heading to our shared quarters, I paused at the open hatch, taking a deep breath before entering. Tabby had just woken up to the alarm. "Ready for dinner?" she asked with defiance. Smiling, I joined her on the bed. "Absolutely," I said, initiating affectionate gestures. Subsequently, we shared an carnal moment. "That was amazing," she expressed. "Much needed." "Agreed. Missed you," I confessed. "Missed you too. Love you so much," she reciprocated. "Love you too," I replied. "Time to clean up and head back?" she reminded. Checking the time, I realized there were about 40 minutes left in the break. "You're right," I acknowledged. "Round 2 during your lunch break?" she suggested with a smile. "Definitely," I agreed. Feeling somewhat improved, I rose, showered swiftly, and headed to the galley. Before exiting the cabin, I kissed her, then adjusted the lighting and reduced the gravity to 0.7 Gs, knowing my grasp of Gravtalk was crucial for our performance, an area where Bull lacked expertise. Lovemaking in space is far from the movie's portrayals. In microgravity, blood moves to the head, not the genitals. Fortunately, the ship's default gravity of 0.8 G allowed us some enjoyment, though it remained challenging. Lower gravity could have made it impossible. Testosterone levels decrease in microgravity, potentially leading to heart shrinkage and reduced blood volume. These concerns, along with pregnancy risks, once deterred NASA from sending couples to space. However, tales of romantic escapades persist, like the rumored exploits of a cosmonaut on the Russian Mir station in the 1990s. Despite initial denials, the cosmonaut later admitted to natural desires, but downplayed their significance. He even mentioned a superior's suggestion to bring an inflatable doll to prevent attachment. Although old restrictions lingered, advancements like artificial gravity in the early 2000s made many concerns obsolete. Consequently, the Corps relaxed its stance, allowing married couples to engage in space closeness under specific conditions. After a satisfying tuna sandwich, I returned to the bridge with 2 minutes to spare before the break. Alan greeted me, asking about my lunch. Satisfied, I settled at my console as instructed. Over the next 17 days, Tabby often visited during lunch breaks, offering comfort during the journey. Minimal interaction with Bull eased concerns, and updates from Alice revealed no suspicious activity. Upon arrival at Mars Station, doubts crept in about my initial reaction. After docking with Mars Station, I changed into my Class C uniform, hoping for shore leave with Tabby at Huygens Base. However, my plans were disrupted when Bull informed me of a problem with one or more weapon stations. "What?" I exclaimed, surprised. Just hours ago, during my shift, I had checked them and found no issues. I turned to Lieutenant Robinson, asking if he knew of any problems. He indicated it happened right before docking. Feeling suspicious, I was determined to investigate further. "We've got 72 hours here," Bull reminded me. "Make sure those weapons are ready by launch." Disheartened, I glanced at Tabby. "It'll be okay," she reassured me. "We'll still visit Huygens. I'll bring you back a souvenir, all right?" Bull smirked. "Don't worry, Jones. I'll watch over your wife," he assured me. "Yeah, I bet you will, you idiot," I thought. Alan approached us. "Ready for some beach time?" he asked. "Yes," Bull replied. "But Jones needs to check the weapon systems." "Any issues?" Alan inquired. "The mini laser's calibration was disrupted, sir," Robinson explained. "When did this happen?" Alan asked. "I noticed it before securing the station," Robinson replied. Alan turned to me. "Better take a look, Lieutenant," he directed. "I'll join you," he added. "Thank you, sir," I said, glancing at Bull. "I appreciate it." "I'll assist, Lieutenant," Robinson offered. "Much obliged, Robinson," I replied. "Let's head to the station before the shuttles depart," Bull urged. Tabby looked at me silently. "Do it, number one," Alan instructed. They left, and I noticed Tabby's silence. I turned to Alice. "Something's fishy, Bill," she whispered. "I'll keep watch." "Thanks," I replied. She smiled and walked away. "I'll change into my work clothes," I said. "Which lasers are acting up?" "Number 2 and number 5, sir," Robinson reported. "I'll handle 2. You check 5, but we'll inspect them all," I instructed. "Understood, sir," Robinson said, heading out. I saw Alan contemplating. "I'll meet you at Laser Station 2, I informed him. "I'll be there shortly," he replied. Grabbing my tools, I exited the bridge. After a few minutes, Alan joined me, now back in his work uniform. "What's happening?" he inquired. "Just about to remove the control box cover," I replied, beginning to unscrew it. Upon inspection, I discovered the issue. A gear in the drive system had broken off, with the E-clip missing. "Uh-oh," I muttered. "What's wrong?" Alan asked. "Someone tampered with this device," I explained. "The E-clip is gone and the drive gear is damaged." "Could it have affected the weapons?" he questioned. "Absolutely," I confirmed. "The impact could have wrecked the system. If the lasers were active, they might have pierced the hull." "How could this happen?" he wondered. "It seems deliberate," I speculated. "These devices are sealed, accessible only with a specific tool, like this one," I said, displaying it. "Can it be fixed?" he inquired. "Yes, but it'll take time," I replied. "About 8 to 10 hours, assuming no further issues arise." "Wow," he remarked. "Need assistance?" While I appreciated his offer, the task was solo. "No, sir, I can handle it, but thanks for offering," I said. "There's only space for one set of hands." Just then, Robinson contacted me. "Boss, the E-clip's broken, and the drive gear's damaged," he reported. I turned to Alan. "We need to replace the entire control box," I informed him. "Agreed," he nodded. "Proceed, and get the armory to inspect all weapon platforms." "Understood," Robinson acknowledged. "What are the odds of 2 control units failing simultaneously?" queried Alan. "Highly unlikely," I responded. "These units are typically very reliable. I've never seen one malfunction, let alone 2 simultaneously. They're considered the most stable in our inventory." "Could it be a manufacturing flaw?" he suggested. "Doubtful, sir," I replied. "These units undergo rigorous testing before installation. In my experience with hundreds of them, I've never encountered such a situation." "I'll need to notify Houston," Alan decided. "Let's bring in engineers from the Martian station and postpone a full Level 5 diagnostic. It's absurd that a trillion-dollar spacecraft could be halted by a cheap E-clip." I nodded. "Keep me informed," I instructed. "Yes, sir," I affirmed. As he exited the cramped space, I resumed my examination. Upon removing the control box entirely, I noticed a dark stain on the interior hull. It wasn't typical transmission grease. Upon closer inspection, it appeared to be blood. The saboteur had evidently injured themselves in the process. Retrieving tweezers from the toolbox, I carefully collected a sample of the substance. I placed it in a small sealed bag and returned it to the toolkit, planning to have it tested for DNA at a medical facility later. Meanwhile, an armorer replaced the faulty control box. Despite trying to focus on my task, I couldn't shake off the disturbing thoughts. Bull seemed to go out of his way to separate Tabby and me, altering schedules and now this sabotage. His words about taking care of Tabby only fueled my suspicions. The idea of her being unfaithful with him made me furious and sick to my stomach. Knowing Bull had been her counselor at the academy and that they had served together before intensified my concerns. Had something been going on between them all along? After completing the installation and running a dry test, I logged the maintenance entry, lamenting the 10 hours lost that were meant for shore leave with Tabby. Reviewing the log, I found no clues. Robinson confirmed the new unit installation and reported no other issues. Despite knowing it would disrupt his shore leave, I instructed him to conduct a full visual inspection and inventory of all weapons and missiles. He agreed and got to work. En route to the bridge, I visited sickbay and spoke with the on-duty corpsman. "How are you, Lieutenant Jones?" she greeted me. "Would you be willing to undergo a DNA test?" I inquired. "We have the necessary equipment, but final analysis requires verification by a certified lab," she explained. I presented my sample. "I need to identify whose blood this is," I stated. "Can you do that?" "Certainly," she replied. "It will take a few hours, and we'll need to compare it to existing DNA records. May I ask why?" "I can't discuss it at the moment, Chief," I replied. "I just need to know whose it is, and I need you to keep it confidential." She agreed to look into it and promised to notify me of any findings. "Thanks, Chief. I appreciate it," I expressed gratitude. "You're welcome, sir," she responded with a smile. She was quite attractive, and for a moment, I pondered how she would look out of uniform. But the thought passed quickly. Afterward, I proceeded to the bridge to give my report. Alan was at the hatch to his ready room when I arrived. "Fixed it?" he inquired. "Yes, sir," I confirmed. "Lieutenant Robinson is currently checking the remaining systems." "All right, step into my office, please," he directed. Inside, I found Alice and Commander Carson, the ship's senior security officer. Alan closed the hatch and took his seat. "Thank you for your prompt response," he acknowledged, addressing Alice and Commander Carson. "We have a situation. It seems we have a saboteur aboard," Alan informed. 2 weapon systems were sabotaged before our arrival at Mars Station. I've been tasked by Command to conduct an initial investigation and to contact the Core Criminal Investigations Division on Huygens. They won't arrive for at least 36 hours, so you have that time to gather as much information as possible. I'm granting both of you access to the entire tracker history temporarily. I need to know who accessed those weaponized units as soon as possible. This investigation must be thorough yet discreet. Understand? We can't have the crew finding out," he emphasized. "We understand, sir," confirmed Commander Carson. "In the meantime, a team of Mars engineers is conducting full Level 5 diagnostics on the ship. It'll take about 72 hours. Command doesn't want us departing with a potential saboteur on board, and I concur. The mission might be canceled," Alan explained. "Any questions?" "Just one, sir," I interjected, drawing everyone's attention. "Yes, Lieutenant," Alan prompted. "I discovered blood on the replaced control box housing. I sent a sample to sickbay for DNA analysis," I reported. "Good call," Alan commended. "I'll speak with Chief Benson about it. Anything else?" We shook our heads. "Dismissed. You have your tasks," Alan concluded. "Yes, sir," Commander Carson affirmed. Exiting the ready room, I secured my tool bag on the weapons console. As I prepared to depart the bridge, Alice called out to me. "Yes, ma'am," I responded. "Bill, I've been monitoring Tabby and Commander Travers. It seems they're quite familiar with each other," she disclosed, showing me her phone with pictures. Shocked, I saw Tabby and Bull entering a club hand in hand, dancing, drinking, and engaging in carnal behavior. Then Alice revealed images of them entering a hotel, implying their intentions were clear. "I'm sorry, Bill," she murmured softly. "I felt you needed to know." "Thank you, Alice," I replied, struggling to hold back tears. "Will you inform the captain?" she inquired. "I have no choice but to report it," she affirmed. "But I wanted you to hear it first." "I appreciate that," I acknowledged. Leaving the bridge, I caught up with Robinson. We completed the remaining system checks and conducted an inventory. My shift ended and I grabbed a snack in the galley before returning to my quarters, attempting to sleep. It was difficult with thoughts of Tubby and Bull swirling in my mind, but I managed to stay awake for a while. Eventually I rose, showered, dressed, and as I prepared to leave, Tabby entered the cabin, appearing refreshed with a glow that often followed closeness. A part of me seethed with anger. "Did you enjoy yourselves?" I asked calmly. "Yes, we did," she replied. "Just returned. Sorry you couldn't join. Maybe next time." I remained silent, observing her. "What were all the engineers doing on the station?" she inquired. "Routine maintenance," I replied. "What's your plan now?" she asked. "I'm going to rest for a bit. Exhausted and off duty for the next 12 hours. Are you starting your shift?" I questioned. "Yes," I affirmed. "Did you resolve the issue?" she inquired. "I believe so," I responded. "Good," she said. "Missed you out there." "Really? That's not the impression I got," I retorted. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I heard you and Bull had fun," I stated. "Anything you want to share?" "We danced, had a few drinks, but that's it," she insisted. "Nothing else?" I probed. "Of course not," she exclaimed, pretending surprise. "Why would you think that?" "Nothing," I said. "I have to get to work." As I moved towards the door, Tabby halted me. She attempted to kiss me, but I turned my head, receiving a kiss on the cheek. "Bill, I love you," she expressed. "What's wrong?" "You tell me," I replied, leaving the cabin without awaiting her response. I questioned myself about the woman's identity. Did she truly believe she could approach me after being with someone else and expect no reaction? Did she think I wouldn't see through her deception? Upon reaching my station, I noticed Bull's absence. Continuing with my tasks, I carried on with diagnostics. After about 7 hours, realizing I hadn't eaten, I took a lunch break. Deciding to visit Tabby in our quarters, I intended to discuss matters with her. However, upon opening the hatch, I was confronted with a sight no husband should witness. Tabby and Bull were on our bed. I noticed an increase in gravity, set at 0.9 G. They both turned to me as Tabby hastily disengaged. Bull, with a smirk, ordered me to shut the hatch, questioning my presence. As Bull dressed, he mocked me, asking if I lacked lovemaking education. After donning his flight suit, he suggested we talk and motioned for a walk. Addressing Tabby, he promised to return for further conversation. Tabby looked at me with sorrow. "I'm sorry, Bill," she whispered. "We'll discuss it later," I responded. Bull declined my question and motioned for me to follow him. Sensing trouble, I activated the video recording function on my suit. All our suits were equipped with a camera feature for such situations. I wanted this encounter documented due to my unease. Bull praised my idea of adjusting the gravity in my quarters as we walked. However, he revealed he had discovered my alterations soon after my arrival. When I inquired how long he had known, he corrected my phrasing with a smirk. Remaining silent, I urged him to continue. He shared that it began during his second year at the academy when he served as Tabby's counselor, claiming she had sought his help with a problem. He insinuated that she was susceptible to his charms. He laughed at his own remarks, thinking himself clever. I seethed with anger, but refrained from violence, mindful of my career. "So you're always there for her, huh?" I queried. "Absolutely, Lieutenant," he responded. "You've got a knack for investigation." "Was that why you changed the bridge schedule?" I pressed. "You caught on, Jones," he admitted. "And the weapon system sabotage?" I continued. "Between us, yes," he confirmed, air quoting, "investigation." "What's your next move?" I inquired. "Planning to injure me?" He chuckled, guiding us into the elevator. "Certainly not, Lieutenant," he assured. "Would I take out an officer just for a fling?" "For now, yes," I retorted. He led me out of the elevator, insisting I was mistaken. According to his recent investigation, I discovered my wife's infidelity, grew distraught, sabotaged the weapon systems to frame her lover, and then took my own life when she revealed her intention to leave me. We halted at the starboard airlock, opposite our docked station. The inner hatch was open, all spacesuits removed, and he brandished a pistol. "You figured it all out?" I challenged. "Absolutely," he smirked. "Now into the airlock." "You won't succeed," I countered. He scoffed. "Who'll command believe? You, a failing husband, or me, a seasoned veteran?" he retorted. Assessing the situation, I noted the gravity set at 0.8 G, not ideal, but manageable. Seizing the moment, I leaped up, struck him twice, and locked him in the airlock. Angered, he demanded I release him. "I have one question, Commander," I interjected. "What?" "Did Tabitha know your plan?" "Of course," he affirmed. "It was her idea. Now open the door." "I won't say more," he warned, aiming his weapon at me. "Now do it." Gazing at the controls, I responded, "Yes, sir," and activated the button. His eyes widened as he realized. The outer door slid open, and he was thrust into the vacuum of space. Caught off guard, he struggled, knowing he had only seconds without a spacesuit. In the void, the air in his lungs would expand, causing immense pain. He would either freeze or suffocate within 15 seconds. I activated the comms, announcing, "Man overboard, number 2 starboard airlock." Instantly, the alarm blared, drawing a crowd to the airlock. Alan and Alice rushed over, followed by Tabby. "Commander Travers, sir," I said, handing him a drive with a video recording. He confessed to sabotaging the weapon and having an affair with Lieutenant Jones. He also planned to eliminate me and make it look like self-destruction. It's all here. "Bull!" Tabby exclaimed, peering into the airlock. By now, Bull's ejection had sent him into an unstable orbit around Mars, making recovery difficult. Turning to me, tears streaming down her face, she accused, "You eliminated him. You fool, I hate you." "That's enough, Lieutenant," Alan intervened, taking Tabby to the orderlies. "Take her to sickbay, then hand her over to security." He turned to me solemnly. "You're relieved of duty for the investigation. I'll handle it." "Yes, sir," I responded quietly. "All right, that's it," Alan commanded. "Back to work. We've done all we can here." He turned to Commander Carson. "Once she's settled, find her a berth away from the bridge. Reach out to Mars Station for Commander Travers' recovery." "Understood, sir," Carson replied, walking off. Alan then addressed Alice. "Looks like you're stepping up, Alice. You're my new number 1 until further notice. Adjust bridge duties accordingly. The mission's likely scrapped." "Yes, sir," she acknowledged. "We've wrapped our initial inquiry, sir. We need to go over our findings." "In my quarters, ASAP," he instructed. "Got it, sir," she affirmed, then turned to me. "I'm sorry, Bill," she offered. "You didn't deserve any of this." "Thanks, Commander," I replied, heading to my quarters. Sorting Tabby's belongings, I packed them in her duffel bag. I wanted her far from me, likely reassigned to the vacant chief pilot's cabin. Security later retrieved her things. I didn't inquire, nor did I care. I flipped the mattress and changed the soiled bedding, tossing the old linens into the laundry. With restricted access to my quarters, I settled at the computer console and filled out a divorce request based on infidelity. Since our marriage fell under JAG jurisdiction, the divorce process also involved them. There was no property or children to divide, and our incomes were equal, so support wasn't applicable. It was a straightforward split where she kept hers and I kept mine. After submitting the request, I awaited confirmation. Within 24 hours, 2 CIA agents from Huygens contacted me, hinting at a vengeful motive. During the interrogation, the JAG officer prevented me from making self-incriminating statements. I spent the next day on edge, avoiding crew interactions to sidestep gossip. While seated in my quarters, Alan and Alice arrived unexpectedly, alleviating my tension. "Lieutenant," Alan began, taking a seat. Alice joined, and I relaxed on the bed. "Mars Station recovered Commander Travers' body and confiscated the illegal firearm attached to him," Alan stated. "The CIU report confirms your actions as self-defense. Commander Travers was present at both sabotaged weapon stations, as shown in the tracking history logs," he continued. "Right before Lieutenant Robinson detected the calibration error," Alice added. "The DNA from the blood matches the commander's, along with his confession to you, proving his responsibility for the sabotage," Alan clarified. "Your wife claims ignorance, but she's detained as an accessory to Travers' plot against you. Possible conspiracy charges await her on Earth." "So we're heading back to Earth, sir?" I inquired. Alan affirmed, "Indeed, Bill. The mission's on hold for now. We'll face a board of inquiry upon return." "Can I resume duty?" I asked. After some persuasion, Houston agreed. "With 2 officers down, we need you on bridge duty. Can you handle ops and gunnery?" Alan questioned, turning to Alice for confirmation. "Yes, sir," I affirmed. "Good," he replied. "We launch in 12 hours, so make sure you're rested and ready." "Thank you, sir," I said. "May I speak with my wife? I need some answers." "Are you certain about this, Bill?" he inquired. "Absolutely, sir," I confirmed. After a brief pause, he consented. "All right, Bill," he agreed. "But Commander Brewster will accompany you. Do you agree, Alice?" "Yes, sir," she confirmed. "Very well," he concluded. "Now, get to work, then rest up. It's time you earned your paycheck." "Yes, sir," I responded. As he left, Alice turned to me. "Ready, Lieutenant?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes, ma'am," I replied. We exited and headed to the brig on the lower deck. "Just so you know, Captain Simmons has commended you," she informed me. "For what?" I questioned, surprised. "He believes your actions saved lives, preventing potential damage to the ship had Travers fired the weapon in the airlock," she explained. "Damn," I muttered. She grinned. Congrats, she said. We arrived at the brig and checked in with the on-duty security officer before approaching a small cell where Tabby sat on the bed, clad in an orange jumpsuit. "What's up, Lieutenant?" she sneered. "So now it's just Lieutenant, not even Bill or Lieutenant Jones," I remarked. "Fine, prisoner. I'll ask a few questions and then leave you be." "Go ahead, Lieutenant," she replied, staring ahead without glancing at me. "How long were you involved with Travers?" "Since sophomore year at the academy," she admitted. "He was my counselor." "I know," I acknowledged. "Where did it start?" "Do you really want to know?" she challenged. "Yeah, I do," I affirmed. "All right, since you asked. I failed a test. He helped me cheat. I owed him, so I entertained him. I enjoyed it, so it kept happening," she explained. "So you cheated with him and then betrayed me, is that it?" "Yes," she confessed. "You don't know how many times I thought of him when I was with you. And you know what? I liked it. You know what else?" "What?" I asked, feeling sickened. "He's been places you couldn't reach. Surprised you could even feel me after him," she taunted. "And you enjoyed working with him all those times." "When we could," she admitted. "You know it's hard to do in low gravity. That's why we did it before and after missions." "Did you ever love me, or was it all a lie?" "I loved you," she admitted. "But I enjoyed being with him too. It was just lovemaking, nothing more." "You knew his plans once we boarded, didn't you?" "Yeah, I did. He wanted to stagger shifts so we wouldn't see each other much. But you found a way to talk to me, surprising both of us. So we decided to wait until Mars," she explained. "And you were aware of the weapons sabotage." "I knew he was up to something, but not the specifics," she confessed. "Just that he wanted to stop your shore leave. We didn't think you'd escalate it to this extent. And my supposed self-destruction was a bonus, right? He blamed it on you. Was it?" "It was his idea," she stated. "But you went along. You never intervened, did you?" "No, I didn't," she admitted quietly. "And I'm sorry. I never thought he'd actually do it." "He failed, and you'll end up in jail." "Was it worth it?" "Doesn't matter," she shrugged. "I was proud of you, how you handled the ship. I loved you. But now, I regret ever meeting you. I'll testify at your trial. Goodbye." As I turned, she called my name, apologizing. Without looking back, I raised my middle finger and walked away. Upon returning to Earth, Tabby was incarcerated in a federal prison for the duration of the investigation and court-martial. Crew members, including myself, Alan, and Alice, testified extensively, enduring days of waiting for developments. My divorce was approved in early April, with the JAG officer handling the remaining paperwork. On Friday, April 18th, we assembled in the hearing room. Alan, Alice, and I sat together while Tabby entered in chains, flanked by armed prison guards. Council members, distinguished by their decorated uniforms, joined the proceedings. Admiral Cartwright, leading the council, initiated the meeting. "Please sit," he began, clarifying it as a board of inquiry rather than a trial, aimed at uncovering what occurred and preventing future incidents. After summarizing the events of the Mars trip, he condemned Commander Travers for prioritizing personal agendas over duty, resulting in endangerment and ship damage. Directing his attention to me, he acknowledged my role. "Senior Lieutenant William Jones," he said, causing me to pause. After a moment, he continued, commending my actions for potentially saving lives and preventing sabotage. Recognizing my diligence, he approved the Distinguished Service Medal recommendation and assigned me to the Advanced Operations School for training starting June 1st. "Thank you, sir," I said. The Admiral acknowledged and shifted focus to Alan. "Captain Alan Simmons," he addressed. Alan stood attentively. "The Council acknowledges your efforts amidst unprecedented circumstances. We recognize your reluctance to challenge senior authority and the unique challenges you've faced. However, as the ship's captain, you bear ultimate responsibility for its operations." "I understand, Admiral," Alan replied. "The Council affirms your command of the USS Armstrong, but notes an entry on your record. Given the ship's modernization, a new crew assignment will be arranged. We propose promoting Lieutenant Sam Dr. Brewster to commander for the first officer role. Expect updated mission orders soon," he concluded. "Thank you, Admiral," Alan acknowledged. Then the Admiral turned to Tabby. "Senior Lieutenant Tabitha Abernathy," he addressed, using her maiden name post-divorce. Tabby rose with the others. "This board expresses profound disappointment in your conduct. You've not only disgraced your ex-husband, but also tarnished your uniform and the service as a whole. Your involvement in this affair, unintended pun aside, may have endangered the lives of many, including your ex-husband. Your statements, along with Travers, led us to reassess your entire record, including your academy performance. Travers' intervention helped you pass a critical test without which you might not have obtained your commission. While your piloting record was commendable, it's evident you should not have been commissioned. Your liaison with Travers resulted in tragedy and endangered lives. Your actions are incompatible with your role. We recognize your pending court-martial, but this board has advised the Personnel Office to revoke your commission, demote you to an E1 crewman, and reduce your pay, effective immediately, he informed, signaling the guards to escort her out. As she approached us, she paused, tears streaming down her face. "Bill," she started, her voice trembling. "Address me cautiously, crewman," I retorted sharply. She straightened up, tears still flowing. "Request to address you as lieutenant denied," I snapped. "Remove her from my sight," I instructed the guards, who promptly complied as she sobbed. At that moment, her words held no significance to me. "A detailed report of the council's decisions will be sent to each of you and added to your records. This council session is adjourned," announced Admiral Cartwright, closing the meeting with a gavel strike. We rose as the council departed. After their departure, Alan turned to me. "Well, that wasn't too bad," he remarked. "How about a drink? I could use one." "I think it went rather well, sir," Alice chimed in. "Why not?" I agreed. We exited the premises and headed to the O Club, where we continued to savor our victory. Update. Standing at the airlock to Galileo Station, orbiting Mars's dark side, I reflected on the past 17 months. Tubby's court-martial had ended a month before I entered the School of Advanced Spacecraft Management. I testified for the prosecution, though recalling my time with her and Bull on Armstrong was unpleasant. This time, Tabby appeared different, wearing a crewman's uniform without flight wings. She had visibly lost weight, her eyes sunken and sorrowful. Losing everything she cherished, her rank, wings, and former husband, she faced a bleak career outlook. Her record would forever bear a stain, barring her from piloting any spacecraft. As the court convened, we rose until instructed otherwise. The judge inquired about the verdict, and the senior member, a full commander, announced guilt for Tabby as an accessory to my attempted homicide, but acquitted her of conspiracy. The defense argued a lack of direct evidence implicating her in the conspiracy. Yet it was clear she knew of Travers' plan to eject me into space and took no action to stop it. The judge sentenced her to 10 years of hard labor in federal prison, followed by a dishonorable discharge. With a gavel strike, the case concluded. Tabby left in chains, never acknowledging me. I attended my class in Florida near Cape Canaveral and relished the training, along with the pleasant weather and surroundings, which included plenty of exposed skin. Graduating after 18 months, I was promoted to lieutenant commander and received orders to Galileo, a secluded station orbiting Mars. Unlike the visible Mars station, I was intrigued by what lay ahead. Upon arrival, I was greeted by Captain Hawkins, an attractive officer, who briefed me on the situation and assured me of a smooth transition. "Are you prepared to see your new home for the next few years?" she asked, leading me to the observation deck. Pressing a button, she revealed a massive advanced ship, the USS Enterprise. "This will be your domain as my operations officer. Ready for adventure?" she asked, her eyes gleaming. "Absolutely, Captain," I replied. With a laugh, she informed me of our imminent launch in 15 days and assigned me daily briefings. "Welcome aboard, Commander," she said, shaking my hand before departing. As I admired the ship, I couldn't help but smile at the sight of the USS Enterprise emblazoned on its side.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another story of Cheating Tales Lab. We're honored to have you here today. Thank you for being part of our community, and we hope this story captivates you. Now, let's dive into this story. The metallic whir of helicopter blades sliced through Seattle's rain-heavy clouds as Antonio Sheridan steadied his Patience 4 line. At 45, he'd spent exactly half his life as Seattle's premier trauma flight nurse, and every one of those years showed in the precise economy of his movements. Rain pattered against the helicopter's windows as Jake Morrison, his pilot and friend of 20 years, guided them towards Seattle Grace Hospital. Stats dropping, Antonio called through the headset, his experienced hands already moving to adjust the flow rate. "Jake, we need to pick up the pace." "Already on it," Jake responded, the helicopter banking smoothly as he adjusted their trajectory. 3 minutes out. Antonio nodded, his focus absolute as he monitored the patient's vitals. This was where he belonged, 3,000 feet above Seattle, making split-second decisions that kept people alive. The familiar pressure in his chest tightened slightly, but he ignored it. There would be time for personal concerns later. The landing pad emerged from the mist, its lights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. Antonio had already radioed ahead. The trauma team would be waiting. As they touched down, he caught sight of his daughter Emma's white coat among the waiting staff. She'd followed him into medicine, though she'd chosen to keep her feet firmly on the ground. "Another miracle in the making," she called out as they rushed the patient inside. "No miracles," Antonio replied, his voice steady as he reported the vital signs. "Just good medicine." It was their usual exchange, comfortable and familiar. But lately, Emma's smile seemed strained, her eyes carrying a weight he couldn't quite understand. He filed the observation away with all the other small changes he'd noticed recently, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't yet assembled. The annual Seattle Grace Hospital fundraiser transformed the austere medical center's conference center into what Lori Sheridan, his wife of 23 years and head of donor relations, called an appropriate setting for seven-figure donations. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in imported silk, while Seattle's medical elite mingled with the city's wealthiest potential donors. Antonio adjusted his bow tie, a concession to the formal dress code he endured once a year. From his position near the bar, he had a clear view of Lori working the room. She moved with practiced grace in her silver Versace dress, a recent purchase she'd claimed was necessary for the position. Dr. Kent Pratt stood too close to her as they spoke with an elderly couple Antonio recognized as major donors. The new cardiothoracic surgeon had arrived 6 months ago with impressive credentials and an ego to match. Now, watching Kent's hands settle on Lori's lower back with casual familiarity, Antonio felt his investigative instincts spark to life. "Your wife certainly knows how to command a room." Sarah Chen's voice carried a note of careful observation as she joined him. Seattle Grace's administrator had been his friend for 15 years, long enough to know when she was probing for information. "She's good at her job," Antonio replied neutrally, noting how Lori and Kent moved between groups in perfect synchronization, their professional smiles never wavering. "Speaking of jobs," Sarah kept her voice low, "have you reviewed the proposal for the new cardiac wing? The one Kent's pushing for?" Numbers seemed rushed. Very rushed. Sarah sipped her champagne. "Interesting choice of contractors, too. Same company that built his wing in Portland. Facility had issues from day one, but the paperwork was impeccable." Before Antonio could respond, Emma appeared at his elbow. His daughter's emerald cocktail dress was a stark contrast to her usual resident scrubs, making her look more like her mother than he'd ever noticed before. "Dad, Mrs. Henderson wants to hear about the mountain rescue from last month." Emma's smile was bright but didn't reach her eyes. "You know, the one with the stranded hiking group?" Antonio caught the quick glance she shot toward Lori and Kent. "Mrs. Henderson can wait. Sarah and I were discussing." "Please." Emma's grip on his arm tightened fractionally. "She's considering a major donation to the emergency response unit." Sarah touched his sleeve lightly. "We'll continue this later, Antonio. Some things need a closer look." Her meaningful glance toward Kent and Lori made it clear she wasn't talking about hospital finances. As Emma led him away, Antonio watched Kent lean in to whisper something in Lori's ear. His wife's laugh carried across the room, the same practice sound she used when convincing donors to add zeros to their checks. The rest of the evening followed a pattern. Every time Antonio moved toward Lori and Kent, Emma appeared with another donor who urgently needed to hear his stories. By the time the last guest departed, he'd cataloged 27 instances of unnecessary physical contact between his wife and the surgeon, 15 secretive whispers, and 4 moments when they disappeared briefly from the room within minutes of each other. The drive home was silent, Lori claiming a headache and retiring immediately to their bedroom. Antonio stayed in his study, reviewing hospital documents Sarah had quietly passed him earlier. The numbers for the cardiac wing didn't add up, cost projections were inflated, equipment requests excessive, and the timeline suspiciously accelerated. His chest tightened as he worked, the pain sharper than usual. Another item for his growing list of concerns, filed away with his wife's recent changed behaviors and his daughter's strange anxiety. The following weeks brought a parade of closed-door meetings Lori claimed were donor consultations. Antonio used the time to investigate, his years of emergency response work making him methodical in gathering information. The contractor's bid is 40% higher than market rate, Jake confirmed over coffee in the pilot's lounge between flights. Same pattern as Portland, according to my contacts there. Antonio rubbed his chest absently. Sarah mentioned unusual consultation patterns in the cardiac unit. Private meetings not logged in the official schedule. Speaking of unusual, Jake leaned forward, voice low. You seen the maintenance contracts for the new equipment Kent's requesting? Companies I've never heard of. Terms that make no sense for a hospital our size. Their discussion ended with the emergency alert. Minutes later, they were airborne, heading toward a multi-car pileup on Interstate 5. Antonio pushed personal concerns aside, focusing on the information coming through his headset. The chest pain struck during patient assessment. One moment he was checking pupillary response. The next device clamped around his heart. The pen light clattered to the helicopter floor as pain shot down his left arm. Antonio? Jake's voice seemed distant through the roaring in his ears. Left, chest. Antonio managed, training taking over even as his vision grayed. Radiating arm. Jake's response was immediate. Seattle Grace, Life Flight 7 declaring medical emergency. Flight nurse having severe chest pain, possible MI. Diverting for immediate landing. Antonio fumbled with his Garmin medical watch. Standard equipment Jake had insisted on after too many disputed in-flight decisions. Through the growing haze, he activated the recording feature, years of handling complicated cases having taught him to document everything. The last thing he saw before consciousness faded was Lori's face as they wheeled him into the ER. Her expression wasn't panic or concern. It was calculated satisfaction as she typed rapidly on her phone. Kent will take excellent care of everything, she said, voice carrying a note of anticipation that sent chills through Antonio's fading awareness. He's the best, after all. As darkness claimed him, he heard Kent Pratt's authoritative voice. I'm taking this case. Cancel the on-call surgeon. Recovery brought a steady stream of suspicious activities. Insurance agents Antonio had never met appeared within hours, claiming Lori had contacted them months ago to review their policies. They spoke quietly with Kent between rounds. Their discussions focused on policy details, particularly the triple payout clause for in-hospital deaths. Quite forward-thinking of your wife, one agent remarked while checking Antonio's paperwork. Upgrading the policy when she did. These things are always easier to arrange before any incidents. Kent's residents monitored him constantly, except for Emma, who could barely enter the room. When she did, her hands shook as she checked his vitals, her eyes avoiding his face. Sarah visited late one night, after the residents' rounds. She closed the door carefully before approaching his bed. I've been looking into Kent's previous positions, she said quietly, showing him a folder. 5 hospitals in 10 years. Each had a string of deaths, terminal patients, all with massive insurance payouts. And every time, there was a grieving spouse who suddenly acquired beach property within months. Antonio studied the medication charts Sarah provided, his years of medical experience noting the discrepancies. The doses were subtly wrong, not enough to trigger immediate concerns, but sufficient to slowly stress a recovering heart. Your wife's name is on the title search for a beachfront property in Malibu, Sarah added. Dated 3 months ago, held in a blind trust until closing. The same realtor handled 3 similar properties for widows from Kent's previous hospitals. Before Antonio could respond, footsteps approached. Sarah slipped the folder away as Emma entered. Her white coat wrinkled from a long shift. Dad, she started, then stopped at the sight of Sarah. I should come back later. Stay, Antonio said firmly, but she was already backing toward the door, the same haunted look in her eyes he'd seen at the fundraiser. After she left, Sarah squeezed his hand. Rest. I'm having some people look into things. Just be careful what medications you accept. Antonio closed his eyes, appearing to drift off, but his hand moved slightly, ensuring his medical watch was still recording. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he assembled the pieces of the puzzle. His wife's suspicious behavior, Kent's rushed proposals, Emma's strange actions, and the growing evidence of a deadly pattern repeated across multiple hospitals. The pain in his chest was still there, but now it had a different quality. This wasn't just medical, this was betrayal, carefully planned and professionally executed. But Antonio Sheridan hadn't spent 20 years saving lives by giving up when things got difficult. He kept his breathing steady, listening as Kent's resident adjusted his medication drip. They thought they were dealing with a vulnerable patient, weakened by surgery and grief. They had no idea they'd given him exactly what he needed. A front-row seat to their operation, with every word and action recorded by the device on his wrist. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. The midnight silence in Antonio's hospital room was broken only by the steady beep of monitors. His eyes remained closed, breathing measured, as familiar voices drifted through his partially open door. The Garmin watch on his wrist blinked silently, recording every word. "The Cayman account is ready." Kent's voice carried a hint of impatience. "Another week of this waiting game, and we risk someone connecting the patterns." "Don't lecture me about patterns," Lori snapped. The clicking of her heels against tile indicated her pacing. "I've managed 3 hospitals' worth of paperwork without leaving traces. The Malibu property is nearly ready. We stick to the timeline. Your daughter's becoming erratic. Did you see how she fumbled the medication orders yesterday? Emma knows what's at stake. One call to the medical board about her little pharmaceutical adventure during residency, and she'll be lucky to work as a veterinary assistant." Their voices faded down the hallway. Antonio waited 5 minutes, then pressed the call button. Emma appeared moments later, her white coat wrinkled from a long shift, dark circles prominent under her eyes. "Your stats look stable," she said mechanically, avoiding his gaze as she checked the monitors. "Sit down." Antonio's voice was quiet, but carried the same authority he used during critical rescues. When she hesitated, he added, "Remember that hiker we airlifted when you were 10? You held his hand the whole flight, promised him he'd be okay. That's who you are, Emma. Not this." The words hit their mark. Emma collapsed into the chair, tears breaking through her professional facade. "I never wanted." During intern year, the hours were endless. Someone offered me Adderall to stay awake, then benzos to sleep. It spiraled so fast. Kent and your mother found out. She nodded miserably. "They said they'd help keep it quiet, protect my career. But it was just leverage. First they wanted information about your skill. Start from the beginning." Emma's confession poured out. How Kent had backdated consultation notes, creating false histories of cardiac symptoms. How Lori used her donor relations position to identify wealthy patients with large insurance policies. The systematic way they stressed recovering hearts with subtle medication changes until natural cardiac events occurred. "There are others," Emma whispered. "Other residents they control. The private facility they're trying to transfer you to, it's owned by Kent's medical school friend. Patients who go there don't come back." Antonio's expression remained neutral, but his mind cataloged every detail. "The medication changes. Show me." Emma pulled out his chart with trembling hands. "They're subtle. Microdoses of medications that stress the heart. Nothing obvious enough to trigger pharmacy alerts, but compounding effects over time." She pointed to specific orders. "These are all falsified. I signed some of them. You'll sign no more." His tone allowed no argument. "Now listen carefully. Tomorrow morning, you'll do your rounds as usual. Act normal. When Kent or your mother give orders, agree, but do nothing. Understood?" She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Dad, I'm so—" "Save it." He cut her off. "Redemption comes through actions, not words. Go." After she left, Antonio activated his phone. The call was answered on the first ring. "Jake. Time to call in that favor from Reuben Benton." The next morning brought a flurry of activity. Jake arrived early, carrying coffee and a thick folder of flight logs. "Reuben's on board," he reported quietly. "Been wanting to nail Kent since his Portland days. I've got documentation of every suspicious patient transfer over the last 6 months. All terminal patients, all wealthy, all dead within days of reaching his friend's private facility. Good. Antonio reviewed the logs. Sarah's blocking their attempt to transfer me there. They'll try something else. As if on cue, Lori swept in, designer heels clicking against tile. Her smile was practiced, predatory. Darling, we've been discussing your care options. Kent knows an excellent private facility. Request denied. Sarachin entered behind her, hospital administrator's badge prominent. Hospital policy requires peer review for high-risk transfers. Dr. Peterson will be taking over Antonio's care. Kent appeared in the doorway, his usual smooth confidence cracking slightly. As department head, Sarah's voice could have cut steel. You're needed in the board meeting. Now. After they left, Sarah turned to Antonio. Ruben's people are in place. We've got FBI agents posing as orderlies on every shift. Security cameras have been adjusted to cover medication storage areas. They'll retaliate, Jake warned. Antonio's smile was cold. I'm counting on it. The counterattack came within hours. Anonymous complaints about Antonio's flight record appeared on Sarah's desk, alleging missed protocols and questionable decisions during critical transports. Amateur work, Jake scoffed, reviewing them. I've got witness statements and documentation for every flight, every decision, every outcome. More concerning was the leak about Emma's drug history to the medical board. But Sarah Chun was prepared. Complete rehabilitation records, she informed the hastily convened review committee, laying out documented evidence. Regular drug tests, counseling sessions, performance reviews. All clean. I can also provide documentation showing who accessed these confidential records without authorization. The committee members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Someone was facing serious HIPAA violations. Meanwhile, Antonio's watch kept recording. Late-night conversations between Kent and Lori grew increasingly desperate. The insurance companies auditing previous cases, Kent hissed during one midnight visit. We need to finish this now. Then stop talking and do it. Lori's voice was ice. The transfer failed, but we still have medication access. Make it look natural, like the others. The final night arrived exactly as Antonio had predicted. His room was dark when Lori and Kent entered, carrying a new medication bag. Such a shame about these cardiac complications, Lori sighed, her voice dripping false concern. At least the triple payout will secure Emma's future. Speaking of payouts, Antonio's voice caused them both to freeze as he sat up, removing his oxygen mask. You should have checked my watch more carefully, honey. It records everything within 20 feet, including your murder plot. The lights flashed on. FBI agents emerged from the bathroom and supply closet, weapons drawn. Reuben Benton stepped forward, badge gleaming. Dr. Kent Pratt, Mrs. Lori Sheridan, he announced with satisfaction, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and a growing list of federal charges. You can't prove anything, Kent snarled, but his face had gone pale. Actually, Sarachin entered, holding up a tablet. We can prove everything. Your previous victims' families have been very cooperative, once shown evidence of insurance fraud and premeditated murder. As they were led away in handcuffs, Lori attempted one final strike. Emma was involved too. She falsified charts, changed medication order. Under documented coercion, Antonio cut her off coldly. Unlike you, she chose to help stop this before more people died. The arrest continued through the night. Insurance agents who had backdated policies. Kent's friend at the private facility who helped cover up suspicious deaths. The real estate agent holding the Malibu property in trust. Offshore accounts located, Reuben reported as the sun rose. Looks like they've been running this scheme longer than we thought. Multiple hospitals, dozens of victims. Good. Antonio's voice was steel. More evidence for prosecution. The morning brought a parade of federal agents collecting evidence and taking statements. Through it all, Antonio's watch kept recording, not because it was needed anymore, but because thorough documentation had become habit. Sarachin surveyed the activity with grim satisfaction. The board will be meeting to discuss emergency replacements in cardiology and donor relations. Check their references thoroughly this time, Antonio suggested, his voice carrying no trace of humor. Emma appeared in the doorway, looking lost. Dad, your statement to the FBI. Everything they made you do, everything you saw. Leave nothing out. His tone was professional, detached. The evidence you've provided helps ensure they can't hurt anyone else. She nodded, understanding the unspoken message. There would be time for personal reconciliation later. For now, there was work to be done. Through the window, dawn painted Seattle's skyline in shades of possibility. The conspirators who had thought Antonio vulnerable had learned too late what his patients had always known. Sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one who waits, watches, and strikes with calculated precision when the moment is right. The federal courthouse buzzed with tension as Antonio Sheridan took the witness stand. 6 months had passed since the arrests, and the trial had exposed a web of corruption deeper than anyone imagined. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Diana Hayes, approached with purpose. "Mr. Sheridan, please tell the court about the evidence you gathered." Antonio's voice carried the same steady authority he used in medical emergencies. The watch recordings documented multiple conversations between Dr. Pratt and Lori Sheridan planning my murder. They discussed offshore accounts, property purchases, and how to make my death appear natural. From the defense table, Kent's expensive suit couldn't hide his seething anger. Lori sat beside him, her designer prison jumpsuit a far cry from her usual attire, her face a mask of cold disdain. "In the previous cases?" Hayes prompted. Investigation revealed similar patterns at 3 other hospitals. Kent would identify wealthy patients through Lori's donor relations network. They'd falsify symptoms, manipulate medications, then profit from insurance payouts when patients died in their private facility. The evidence mounted through the day. Financial records showed millions flowing through shell companies. Former hospital staff testified about suspicious transfers and sudden deaths. Family members of previous victims described identical patterns, loved ones with manageable conditions suddenly deteriorating after meeting Kent and being transferred to his friend's facility. They used their positions to identify targets. Jake Morrison testified, his pilot's precision evident in his detailed documentation. Every wealthy patient with good insurance became a potential victim. The flight records showed a clear pattern of emergency transfers to their private facility, always followed by death certificates citing natural causes. Sarah Chin's testimony proved devastating. Dr. Pratt used his department authority to override normal protocols. Mrs. Sheridan's donor relations position gave them access to patients' financial information. Together, they created a perfect killing system for profit. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Michael Warren, a resident who had worked with Kent at his previous hospital. "He blackmailed me too, just like Emma Sheridan. When I threatened to expose him, another resident who knew about the scheme committed suicide. They used that death to control the rest of us, claiming we'd be implicated if we spoke up." Through it all, Antonio sat ramrod straight in the gallery, watching his former wife's facade crack as each new piece of evidence emerged. When she finally took the stand in her own defense, her attempt at playing the victim fell apart under cross-examination. "You expect us to believe you were unaware of these deaths?" Hayes demanded. "I was just doing my job." Lori's voice dripped contempt. "Finding donors, building relationships. If some of them happened to die under Kent's care, that's hardly my. Yet you purchased property in Malibu 3 months before attempting to murder your husband," Hayes cut in. "Property paid for with money traced directly to previous victims' insurance payouts." Antonio was a fool, Lori snapped, her mask finally slipping. So concerned with saving lives, he never saw the opportunity. "Do you know what it's like being married to someone so blindly righteous?" Kent understood ambition. He knew how to turn all those dying patients into something useful. The jury took less than 6 hours to reach a verdict. Kent stood arrogantly as the forewoman read the charges, his confidence crumbling with each guilty. 30 years for conspiracy to commit murder. 30 more for the deaths at previous hospitals. Additional decades for fraud, racketeering, and money laundering. Lori's sentencing came next. She remained coldly composed until the judge spoke. "Your actions betray not just your marriage vows, but the fundamental trust between medical institutions and the public," he declared. "You used your position to identify victims, exploited families at their most vulnerable, and attempted to murder your own husband for profit. 30 years seems insufficient, but it's the maximum I can impose. As they were led away, Lori turned to Antonio. I hope you're satisfied with your moral victory. Was it worth destroying everything we built? Antonio's response was calm, measured, and final. We built nothing. I saved lives while you plotted deaths. The only difference is now everyone knows exactly what you are. The aftermath brought changes. Emma testified about her coerced involvement in exchange for immunity. Her voice shook as she detailed how they'd exploited her addiction and threatened her career. I started using Adderall during intern year, she admitted to the court. Kent found out, offered to help keep it quiet. Then they started small, asking me to adjust medication orders, sign off on chart changes. When I realized what was happening to the patients, they threatened to expose my drug history, said I was already implicated, would lose my medical license. The judge recommended minimum immunity requirements in exchange for her cooperation. Within a week, Emma transferred to Chicago's trauma unit. Her goodbye with Antonio was brief, professional. She left a letter he filed away unopened in his desk, marked simply past complications. Later, cameras caught Kent's private facility being raided, his medical school friend led away in handcuffs. The forensic audit revealed dozens of suspicious deaths, each following the same pattern. Wealthy patients transferred in, massive insurance payouts transferred out. They found offshore accounts totaling millions, Sarah Chin reported, reviewing the final case files in Antonio's office. Every victim's insurance payout, every property deal, all perfectly documented by their own greed. And the Malibu property? Antonio asked, though he already knew. Seized along with everything else. The federal prosecutor is arranging for proceeds to go to the victims' families. Antonio nodded, satisfied. Justice had its own kind of precision, not unlike the medical calculations he made every day in the air. The correct diagnosis, the proper treatment, the right outcome. It all came down to paying attention before they claimed more victims. Jake remained his steady partner in the air, their wordless understanding strengthened by shared battle scars. They never discussed the trial, but their flight logs became even more detailed, every decision documented with meticulous care. Antonio's legitimate insurance payout could have bought beachfront property in any exclusive neighborhood. Instead, he chose a modest house on Oregon's quiet coast, far from Malibu's pretension. The view wasn't as spectacular, but it was honest, like the work that paid for it. In the end, the biggest change wasn't in policies or procedures. It was in perspective. Every Thursday evening, after his last flight shift, Antonio would take a moment to watch the sunset from 2,000 feet. From that height, the line between light and shadow was crystal clear. He'd learned that some people chose the shadows, turning medicine's healing purpose into a weapon for profit. His job wasn't to understand them or to regret their choices. His job was to recognize the darkness when it appeared, stand against it without flinching, and always fly toward the light of dawn. The helicopter's radio crackled. Another emergency, another life hanging in balance. Antonio pushed memories aside, focusing on the coordinates with professional precision. The past had its place, filed away in courthouse records and desk drawers. The future waited in the next rescue, the next flight, the next chance to prove that even in medicine's darkest corners, there were still those who remembered their fundamental oath. First, do no harm. And for Antonio Sheridan, that was enough. Epilogue. 5 years later, the federal maximum security prison's visitor room remained as austere as the day Lori Sheridan first entered it. 5 years into her 30-year sentence, the former donor relations director's designer confidence had eroded into institutional monotony. Her orange jumpsuit hung loose on her frame, expensive highlights grown out to reveal steel gray roots. The guard's voice echoed. Visitor for Sheridan. Sarah Chun sat across the table, official paperwork in hand. Your appeal was denied. Again. Get out. Lori's voice had lost its smooth, manipulative edge, replaced by bitter harshness. You'll want to hear this, Sarah continued, unmoved. The feds found another offshore account. The victims' families are getting those funds too. That beach house you dreamed of? They're turning it into a recovery center for medical professionals dealing with ethical pressures. Lori's hands clenched. Still playing the righteous administrator? How's my ex-husband's little reform crusade going? Antonio's foundation has exposed 4 more schemes like yours. Interesting pattern, doctors and administrators working together, targeting wealthy patients. Sound familiar? Sarah's smile was professional, pointed. Your case study is now required reading in medical ethics courses. 3 cells down, Kent Pratt's fall from grace had been even more dramatic. The former surgeon spent 23 hours a day in isolation. Other inmates had their own code about doctors who killed for profit. His medical license was permanently revoked, his academic papers retracted, his name becoming synonymous with healthcare fraud. His latest appeal had included a rambling manifesto claiming conspiracy. The judge's response was brief. Petition denied. Kent's former medical school friend, serving 20 years for his role in the private facility deaths, had turned state's evidence, providing details of even more victims. Meanwhile, Seattle Grace Hospital had transformed. Antonio's trauma flight program now included intensive ethics training. Every new flight nurse learned not just medical procedures, but warning signs of institutional corruption. Your primary duty is to your patients, he told each class, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Politics, profit, pressure. None of that matters at 2,000 feet with a life in your hands. Jake Morrison, still his pilot after 25 years, would add his own lessons. Document everything. Trust your instincts. And if something feels wrong, it probably is. Their partnership had become legendary in emergency response circles. Each flight logged with military precision, every decision documented, creating an unbreakable chain of accountability. Sarah Chin's retirement from hospital administration hadn't slowed her down. The foundation she and Antonio started had grown into a national watchdog organization. They provided anonymous reporting systems, legal support, and protection for medical professionals facing ethical dilemmas. We lost 2 residents to suicide because they felt trapped, she reminded oversight committees. That never happens again. Emma found her own path to redemption in Chicago. Rising to chief resident, she channeled her experience into protecting new doctors from similar exploitation. Her trauma unit became known for both medical excellence and ethical integrity. Her monthly letters to Antonio continued, still filed unopened in his desk, but recently, he'd moved them to a new box labeled Future Considerations. Some wounds healed enough to examine, given time. The Oregon Coast House proved perfect for Antonio's needs. Close enough to his flight duties, far enough from painful memories. On clear evenings, he'd watch the sunset from his deck, the same time he used to view it from the helicopter. The final ironies proved fitting. Lori's carefully hidden funds now supported whistleblower programs. Kent's private facility became a treatment center for impaired medical professionals. Their elaborate scheme to profit from death instead strengthened protections for life. Prison reports showed their true characters. Lori attempted to manipulate other inmates, only to find her tactics useless in a world where designer smiles meant nothing. Kent's arrogance crumbled into paranoid isolation, his surgeon's hands now used only to write failed appeals. They aged separately, similarly. Each court rejection, each seized asset, each new revelation of their crimes stripped away more of their carefully constructed facades. The beautiful socialite and ambitious surgeon reduced to cautionary tales in medical ethics lectures. Their victims' families found different forms of closure. Some used the recovered funds for medical scholarships. Others established patient advocacy programs. All ensured their loved ones' deaths served to protect future patients. Antonio's foundation grew beyond its origins. They trained hospital staff to recognize warning signs, provided legal resources for ethical challenges, and maintained a database of suspicious patterns in patient care. The system only works if we protect those who protect patients, he would tell medical boards. His testimony helped pass legislation strengthening whistleblower protections in healthcare. Jake still flew their regular routes, their weekly sunset flights now a tradition. They'd added a 3rd seat for training new flight nurses, passing on lessons learned at terrible cost. Sarah Chin's oversight committees expanded nationally. Corruption thrives in shadows, she testified before medical boards. Our job is to keep the lights on. Emma's trauma unit in Chicago became a model program, combining intensive medical training with ethical leadership. Her residents learned early that moral courage was as vital as medical skill. The desk box of her letters remained ready. When the time came to open them, Antonio knew the conversations would be about future healing, not past wounds. The final word came through official channels. Lori and Kent's last appeal had been rejected. The court's language was unmistakable. They would serve every day of their 30 years. In his Oregon home, Antonio filed the notice without comment. Tomorrow would bring new flights, new patients, new chances to prove that medicine's highest purpose remained unchanged: to heal, to protect, to serve life rather than profit from death. The helicopter waited on its pad, blades ready to turn, Jake checking the pre-flight list with characteristic precision. Another trauma call, another life hanging in balance. Some chose darkness, others chose light. Antonio Sheridan had always known which way to fly.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.
I discovered my wife cheating with her boss during a business trip and chose divorce over deception. Every bit of this was entirely beyond my comprehension from the very start. 11 years ago, I completed my college education and returned to my hometown after self-financing my studies. Due to self-funding, I didn't receive any financial support. Nevertheless, I obtained the right to free employment and landed a respectable, well-paying job. As I built a successful career, I often had to travel to the regional center, where I once ran into my fellow student Earl. We weren't close pals, but we consistently had enjoyable conversations. Earl eventually assisted me, and the approvals, which took weeks, were secured. One day, Earl suddenly became the CEO of the company founded by his wife Zara's parents. It was at a friendly gathering at Earl's place that I met my future wife Lila. Lila was wrapping up her university studies and residing with her retired parents in the city center. Somehow, we started dating. Our relationship heated up, and after 6 months, realizing Lila was pregnant, I proposed to her. She accepted on the condition that I moved to the regional center. I agreed, and we had a wedding attended by Earl and his wife Zara. Lila's parents generously gifted us a 3-bedroom apartment inherited from her mother-in-law's sister, which was registered under Lila's name. We had a son, and soon after, Lila became pregnant again and gave birth to a daughter. Based on Earl's recommendation, I secured a job with a highly reputable organization. There, I quickly established myself as a knowledgeable specialist. Unsurprisingly, the company led by Earl was given priority in selecting contractors for construction projects, especially when I represented the client. Work was thriving, and earnings were outstanding. 10 years passed, and our son was about to start 4th grade, while our daughter was entering the 2nd grade. 2 weeks ago, I sat in a hotel's conference room. The negotiations were intense and dragging on, so they called for a break. I went out with one of the representatives from the Capitol to the conference room's balcony and took a seat at a table. The representative, observing the hotel visitors in the lobby, remarked about how many years had passed and how Earl was still in love with his wife and happily married, even though old habits die hard. Earl, who was over at the reception desk checking out, was with his girlfriend by the kiosk. I noticed Earl at the front desk with his wife Lila at the kiosk. Earl finished checking out, and they both walked to the elevator. At first, my immediate impulse was to locate them and confront Earl physically. However, I realized that such an action would lead to failed negotiations, a public brawl, and a possible divorce. I pondered the sound I heard in my ears. It had been years. I turned to the person I was conversing with. I inquired about how long the person had known him, and they responded that they had known him for a long time. They mentioned being a local resident and living in the area for years. Earl had met his current wife, Zara, after college. According to the person, Zara came from a well-off family, with her father being an entrepreneur who had founded several businesses with his wife. Earl had married Zara and had quickly assumed the role of CEO in one of the companies. However, the person mentioned avoiding any business dealings with Earl due to his unreliability and lack of trustworthiness. Once the negotiations were concluded and the contract was signed, I returned to my office. I sat at my desk and began contemplating my next steps. It was evident that I needed to part ways with my wife. However, I also needed to ensure my role as a father to our children. I had to secure a place to live after our divorce. The apartment we resided in was gifted to us by Lila's parents, with the property deed in her name. So the best course of action was to return to my parents' house, which, God willing, had 2 floors, with the 2nd floor unused. Lila had never visited my hometown, expressing reservations about what she would do there. The departure was a decision I had to arrange, ensuring I didn't break my promise to take the children to the seaside this year and avoiding deceiving them. With a plan in mind, I began to put it into action. I was well aware of Earl and his wife's routines. I knew that Zara typically went to a cafe located away from their workplaces for lunch, believing that the food there was superior. She had invited me and Lila to dine there multiple times. Now I understood why Lila never visited that cafe and why Earl never frequented it either. The following day, I entered the cafe and spotted Zara. I sat down at her table. She greeted me, and I inquired if she was trying out the local cuisine. She replied that she didn't just decide to try the local food, and I asked about Earl. She confirmed that it was indeed about Earl and Lila. I shared that I had suspected him for a long time, but I couldn't prove it as he was always home on time. Zara inquired about where I had caught them, and I explained that it was at a hotel downtown where he had a friend working as a director. Zara asked how long they had been dating, and I informed her that they started dating before I met Lila. She expressed her dismay, mentioning how Earl had introduced Lila to her as a friend of mine. I mentioned that I took a DNA test to be sure about the kids, and Zara shared that Earl was unable to have children due to treatment that had not produced any results. She expressed her desire to have kids. We discussed our plans, and I mentioned that I intended to divorce Lila and change my last name. Zara planned to divorce Earl but wanted concrete evidence. We discussed the idea of setting up webcams to catch them in the act, and I agreed to keep in touch about the plan. I explained that I needed to return home since Lila owned the apartment, and Zara offered to talk to her father about helping me find a place to live. We agreed to set a date for further discussion. In the following days, I prepared for my upcoming separation from my wife. I informed the school about our plans to move and transfer the kids to a new school in a different city. I had to obtain confirmation of the kids' enrollment in the new school during working hours, and the necessary documents were provided. Zara called and asked for passports to obtain visas for a trip to Italy, the city of Pesaro. The visas were quickly obtained. Soon she told me that she had spoken to her father about Jason and his job at the new branch. Her father conducted a background check and approved it, asking her to come in for an interview. After the conversation with Zara's father, where they arranged his position and salary, I spoke to my boss about the situation. My boss, who had been divorced twice before, asked how he could help. I explained that I needed a quiet vacation and to be let go from my job. I inquired if there was a way to work it out. My boss considered it and eventually agreed. The preparations for the separation were finalized. I told Lila about my upcoming business trip, which would only last 3 or 4 days. On the same day, Lila informed her husband Earl about my departure, and he was happy about it. He mentioned that his wife was spending 2 weeks at a sanatorium. She asked about my plans for the kids, and I explained that I would take them to my parents' place since it was vacation time and they couldn't stay at home. Lila expressed her frustration about having a baby, mentioning that she couldn't have children, and suggesting I hire a nanny or rely on my husband. We discussed our plan for the next day, with Lila mentioning that she would be leaving in the morning. I packed my travel bag, said goodbye to Lila, and headed to the train station, though I actually just took a shuttle bus 1 stop away. My hired car for long-distance moving was waiting there, and we drove to my house, where I saw Lila taking the children and getting into a cab with them, heading to her parents' house. Half an hour later, Lila arrived at her mother's house, telling her she had brought the grandchildren and asked when they could go to the sea. She promised to call every night and then got into a waiting cab to go to work. Meanwhile, I packed up the house, putting everything in the cardboard boxes. The boxes were immediately loaded into the car, and within an hour and a half, everything was packed and ready. Only a large suitcase and 2 bags were packed separately. After packing the car, I called my father and told him that the movers were on their way to his place, and I would join them in a month. Lila, on the other hand, informed the CEO that I had left and the kids were with her grandparents, so she was free until Monday. The CEO agreed to let her leave an hour early. After working most of the day, Lila signed out early, claiming to attend a meeting with a customer. She left the office, and shortly after, Earl left as well, driving away. Zara, who had placed a tracker and microphone in the car, noticed that it had started moving around the city and saw the car turn into an alley and stop. The door closed and there was an immediate sound. Lila mentioned that they needed to go to the store, and Earl replied that they had everything at home. Around the same time, I stopped by my in-laws' house and informed them that I was picking up the kids, as Lila had told them the kids would stay with them for 3 or 4 days. They decided to celebrate their 10th wedding anniversary and had a surprise planned for Lila. 10 minutes later, the kids and I headed to the airport, with our flight scheduled for 2 hours later. Lila entered Earl's kitchen, checked the refrigerator, and set a complete table. She asked Earl to open a bottle of champagne and suggested having some cake later. Earl questioned what they were toasting to, and Lila mentioned that it was their 10th anniversary. Even though I had pointed out that it was partly due to her affair with a client's lawyer, they sat down for dinner. Afterward, they went upstairs to the bedroom. Lila cleared the dishes and put them in the sink, and then they enjoyed some fruit and cognac on the coffee table before heading into the shower. After they came out, Lila suggested she would call her parents and be all his in the meantime. Earl agreed, and she made the call. Lila, in the meantime, quickly stood up, dialed my number, and told me she wanted to congratulate me on our 10th wedding anniversary. I was puzzled and questioned why she was saying that. Lila then mentioned that she was in Earl's bedroom, not fully dressed, and he was looking at her while she spoke to me. Hurt by her words, I offered to come over and talk, believing she would understand, and I asked her not to go away. Lila burst into tears, and Earl looked confused. The bedroom door suddenly opened, and Zara's parents entered, with Zara following behind them. Lila quickly started dressing. Zara's father asked Earl what was happening. Earl replied that they were just having a good time. Zara's mother commented on Earl being undressed, and Zara firmly decided to cut him out of her life. Zara's father advised Earl to write a resignation letter and warned him that if he messed up again, he would be fired. Lila thanked them and left. Back at her apartment, Lila realized no one was home and tried calling me, but there was no signal. I had nearly finished observing what was happening in the bedroom, turned off my tablet, and called Zara. She informed me that they were on their way to the landing with the kids and hoped to hear from me when they returned. We soon boarded the plane and headed to a different city. Our flights were well coordinated, and we eventually landed in Italy. A company representative helped us get to the hotel on the coastline. After checking in, the kids were eager to go to the sea visible from their window. They encountered a woman and her 7-year-old daughter, who had been on the same flight. The woman had experienced motion sickness, but her daughter was eager to get to the sea. I suggested looking after her daughter so the woman could rest. Regina, the woman, introduced herself, and we made our way to the sea. Following wooden ladders almost to the water's edge, small fish swam in the shallow water, and I even managed to catch a small crab. Afterward, we went swimming, and Regina decided to join. Meanwhile, Earl was dealing with the issue of finding a place to live. With help from his parents, he managed to secure a one-room apartment but struggled to find employment. He had some savings to get by but needed to think about his future. Earl began searching for jobs in various offices but faced challenges, as most executive positions were already filled, and he didn't want a lower-level job. Eventually, he couldn't even secure a position as an ordinary engineer. Lila spent 2 days searching for me and the children around the city but couldn't locate us. Contrary to what my father believed, she did try calling us. My parents explained that I had moved my belongings to their place and gone somewhere else with the kids. Lila assumed I had gone on vacation and decided to visit my office to find out more. There, she learned that I had resigned. In the evening, Lila called Earl and asked about his situation. Earl explained the meager conditions of his one-bedroom apartment and the job struggles he was facing. Lila discussed her own work situation and the establishment of a branch office, but Earl had no information about my plans. She mentioned her intention to try and reunite with her husband and kids, as well as her regrets about her past relationship with Earl. Earl inquired about my current situation, and Lila informed him that she was unsure of my whereabouts or my decision to leave with the kids. On that day, Lila gathered her courage and visited the cottage where Zara lived. Zara silently invited her inside, and they had a conversation in the large hall on the first floor. Lila began with an apology and asked Zara to understand her actions. She questioned why Zara continued working for their company, expressing her ignorance of Zara's history with Earl and their relationship. Zara explained that she had not known about Lila's relationship with Earl, and they discussed their shared experiences of being deceived by him. I came to the realization that Earl wouldn't accept my kids, and I didn't even know where they were at the moment. Zara tried to reassure me, saying that I shouldn't worry, as my children were mine and Earl couldn't have kids. Since Earl was single now, she suggested that there was no obstacle preventing us from reconciling. I responded by explaining that I had realized I didn't need him as a partner. Earl had contacted me upon learning that I was alone and asked to stay with me, but I had refused. I also shared my concern about not being able to find Jason and the kids. I mentioned that he wasn't at his parents' house, even though he had moved his things there. I knew he had gone on vacation with the kids to the sea, but I had no idea when he would return. It was almost September 1st, and the kids had school. I expressed my confusion about what to do and how to bring Jason back. Zara advised me that she couldn't assist with that and indicated that it was unlikely that Jason would forgive me and take me back. Today, Regina and her daughter Rose left the hotel and headed toward the center of Pesaro. After I provided a brief explanation to the children about the direction they should take, they walked ahead. Regina asked if we really needed such a detailed explanation. I responded that we did because in the city where we came from, they talked about bike lanes, but they were rarely seen. We weren't accustomed to the concept of separating pedestrian zones from cycling lanes and the areas for vehicular traffic. Here, cyclists didn't ride in pedestrian zones, even if they were empty, as the locals adhered strictly to the designated lanes. We strolled leisurely through the city in the evening and eventually reached the Sphere Monument. Regina asked about the significance of the monument. I explained that it was the Sphere Grande de Pomodoro, with Arnaldo Pomodoro being the sculptor behind the monument, who happened to be a native of Pesaro. I also shared some of the city's attractions, such as its beautiful sandy beaches, pristine sea, and a running promenade with a long pier extending into the sea, perfect for a relaxing stroll and enjoying the waters. Regina expressed her surprise at the city's fame and Italy's rich history. Regina then asked how I knew so much, wondering if I were a history teacher. I clarified that I wasn't, but I had done some research about the places we might visit on the internet when I found out where we were going. I didn't want to be completely clueless, as it could save us from misunderstandings. Regina suggested visiting the Linate Aquarium and inquired if it was nearby. I explained that it wasn't exactly nearby, as it was in Cattolica, about 22 kilometers away, which we could reach in about half an hour. Regina agreed to the plan. I asked Regina about our plans for the next day. She mentioned that we could sleep in, since we planned to visit the Rossini Theater and explore the old town. However, the day after, we would wake up early at 7, as we hadn't come there to sleep. I proposed grabbing breakfast on the go and assured Regina that I had the theater and old town route covered. Regina then asked where we should go next, and I suggested heading to a nearby restaurant. Regina hesitated slightly, noting that we had just had dinner. I reassured her that we would only have a little something to eat, and we headed to an open-air restaurant where the waiter handed us menus. We quickly placed our orders, with me being mindful of the children. As we enjoyed our meal, I asked Regina about her ability to travel with her young daughter despite her husband. Regina explained that she was not married and described her past relationship. She mentioned how they had never officially registered their relationship, and after their daughter Rose was born, he began distancing himself and even brought another woman home. Regina had decided to move out with her daughter and was considering returning to her mom's neighborhood. She also mentioned that her husband showed no interest in helping with their daughter, and Rose's birth certificate had a dash under father, which meant she could sue him for child support. However, Regina didn't want to do that and was determined to raise her daughter on her own. I inquired about her field of expertise, and Regina explained that she was a civil engineer. She had managed to save money for the trip by doing various jobs, including providing cost estimates for clients who needed help with their building projects. Unfortunately, the company she worked for had gone bankrupt, and she was currently technically unemployed but remained optimistic about the future. We continued our conversation while sipping on dry Italian wine, and the children had a taste of the seafood salad. Regina mentioned that her mother lived in a nearby village just 5 kilometers away from the city center. I shared with Regina that I had been appointed as the branch director in the city. She found it coincidental that we were both from the same hometown. After finishing our meal, we returned to our hotel late in the evening. I reminded Regina about our early start the next day to visit the aquarium. The kids asked about our plans, and I explained that we would be seeing sharks. The following day, we arrived at the Acquario di Cattolica, a popular oceanarium in Cattolica. We spent a significant amount of time observing the marine life in various pools and aquariums. Our visit even included an aquarium where visitors could touch the creatures, which brought joy to the children. After our visit, we decided to look for a place to eat outside the aquarium to avoid the higher prices. While searching for a restaurant, we spotted a bus heading back to Pesaro, so we decided to return for lunch. In around 40 minutes, we found ourselves at a familiar seaside cafe, enjoying classic Italian dishes like pasta with chicken parmesan. After our meal, we decided to hit the beach despite the scorching sun and the city's siesta time, which made things a bit inconvenient for tourists. We returned to the hotel, grabbed our towels, and met at the reception before making our way to the beach. The children eagerly stripped down and splashed into the water, with Regina and me following suit. After gathering our belongings, we spent some time in the water, watching the children excitedly chase small crabs in the shallow waves. Regina took the opportunity to ask me if that was why I was on vacation without my wife. I confided in her, explaining that I had discovered my wife was having an affair with her ex-boyfriend, who had married her for her position and money, even putting her to work with him. Regina inquired about my plans, and I revealed that I had taken what I could and moved back to my parents' house. I had decided to go on vacation with the kids, and reconciliation was not in the cards. She asked about the kids, and I explained that they would stay with me. I mentioned that, in a divorce, the court typically favored the mother, so I had considered waiting until the children were 14, at which point they could decide which parent to live with. Divorce wasn't in the immediate plan, but I wouldn't be living with my wife. Regina inquired if I could handle 2 kids on my own, and I replied that I was managing. I shared a story about a guy I knew whose wife had left him with 2 girls, and when she returned 8 years later, the girls refused to let her in. They had already divorced by then. Regina asked, "What if your wife initiated the divorce?" I mentioned that my son Martin's opinion could be considered in court, but it wasn't the sole determining factor. She asked about my plan, and I explained that I would keep the kids hidden if needed, despite potential legal consequences. Regina questioned if the kids wanted to spend time with their mother, and I replied that it wasn't likely in the near future. Regina then asked if I would accept her offer to work at her branch, and I agreed, saying I'd like to but needed to find a place to live, as it was challenging to find a job in my neighborhood, and I didn't want to lose my professional qualifications. Regina assured me that she would assist in finding accommodation and enrolling Rose in school. Their vacation eventually ended, and they returned home. Upon our return, I took the kids shopping for school supplies. In the afternoon, I called Samuel to discuss the branch's need for engineering and technical workers and mentioned Lila's new position. As for Earl, he had disappeared without a trace, and no one knew his whereabouts. On Sunday, I went to pick up Regina and Mary, arranging for them to stay on the 2nd floor of my parents' house. The kids were excited to have Mary living with them, and they would all be attending school together. Regina prepared for her first day of work on Monday, while I had my responsibilities to attend to. The children still had 3 more days of vacation and stayed with my parents. Meanwhile, Lila remained completely unaware of my and the children's whereabouts. She went to work and made efforts to locate me, as she believed it was close to September 1st. She decided to visit the school, only to find out that I had transferred the children to a school in the neighborhood near my parents' home. She planned to visit them on the first Friday of September. Back at the office, there was much speculation about Earl's sudden departure and Lila's relocation. Many employees were curious about the reasons behind the leadership changes. Eventually, news of the branch's opening reached the office, and Lila also received this information. On the first Friday of September, Lila took a day off at her own expense and headed to the district center. She arrived early in the morning, armed with my parents' address, and located their house on the street. Approaching the gate, Lila observed me along with Martin and Mary leaving the house. They were accompanied by an unfamiliar woman and a girl about Mary's age. Unnoticed, Lila followed them and soon realized that the woman and I were taking the children to school before heading to work. Observing this, Lila decided to wait for the workday to begin. Once it did, she approached the reception area, where a young secretary was sorting through papers. The secretary called me and asked if I would accept a visitor, to which I agreed. Lila was then permitted to enter the office. Inside, she found me sitting at a desk covered with papers. I greeted her, and she returned the greeting. I gestured for her to sit and commented on her nice office. She thanked me and mentioned that her assistant had handled all the arrangements. Getting to the point, Lila said she was there to discuss our next steps, understanding that keeping our family together was unlikely but emphasizing the need to work things out for the sake of our children. I agreed, expressing my desire to maintain custody of the kids while also wanting to be involved in their lives and see them. Lila conveyed her concern about not losing touch with the children, seeking assurance from me. I assured her that the kids were at school and that I had plans to spend time with them, including going mushroom hunting in the woods the next day. Lila commented on Regina being my new partner, which I confirmed. She inquired if she could meet the kids, and I agreed, explaining that the children and I had planned various activities in the coming months. I requested that she give me advance notice, as our schedules were already filled. Lila mentioned that I had always enjoyed surprising people, prompting me to share that we had vacationed on the Adriatic Sea in Italy. She asked about Earl and my new phone number, to which I revealed that I hadn't changed my number. I had just turned it back on. After our conversation, Lila left the office, as per my suggestion, and went to a cafe. I then called Regina to inform her about my meeting with Lila and her requests to see the children. Regina expressed her opinion that preventing a mother from seeing her children might not be wise. Regina and I discussed the situation. I explained that I didn't expect Lila to show up and was uncertain about making a decision on my own. Regina firmly expressed her decision not to interfere, emphasizing that it was a choice I had to make independently. I mentioned that I had already made up my mind a long time ago when I discovered Lila's infidelity. I stated that nothing would change that decision, as the deception had persisted for too long. Regina inquired about the time it would take to heal, and I shared that it varied from person to person, typically 3 months to a year for men, and a month or 2 for women. During this period, some might want to return to a relationship driven by a yearning for lost love, while others would seek a fresh start if there was no love left. Later, I decided to meet Lila at a cafe as planned. I arrived early and found Lila in a conversation with Regina, who appeared tearful. Lila assured me that I wasn't interrupting and said they had discussed arrangements for picking up the kids from school, feeding them, and taking them to the park. I asked what had transpired during their conversation. Lila explained that they talked about how Lila and I had met and how her daughter had liked me. Regina had described me as reliable and safe, and had convinced Lila not to confront me about the children. I asked Lila if she agreed with Regina's perspective, and she nodded in agreement, acknowledging that she had grown distant from her children over the years. She expressed her remorse and explained that she had been influenced by Earl, leaving most of the childcare responsibilities to me. Lila realized she couldn't handle the kids without my help, but she understood that I wouldn't forgive her for her deceit. She also mentioned that Regina seemed to understand her better than she understood herself, and that Mary was getting along well with Regina's daughter. I asked if they were planning to eat, and Lila informed me that they were heading to the park to wait for the kids. She assured me that the children would find them there, as they often walked to the park and fed the swans. We left the cafe and went to the park, where I directed them to a bench by the water, explaining that we often walked there and fed the swans. Lila asked if the swans had flown away yet, and I told her they hadn't, but they would soon, having sent their young ones on their way. Lila then questioned why I had married her. I honestly admitted that she was not the woman of my dreams, and explained that I had married her because Earl had insisted on it. I revealed that Earl's motivation was to use our marriage as a cover for his own marital issues with his wife, Zara. Lila inquired about how Earl had taken the situation, and I explained that he had been jealous but unable to take any action. Additionally, when I became pregnant, he believed the child was his, as Lila had been away for a while. It was only a year and a half later, during one of my business trips, that Lila became pregnant with Mary. I inquired whether he still believed the children were his. Lila shared that Zara had informed her that Earl wasn't capable of having children. She mentioned that Zara had told her the same thing when they met while she was searching for me. I questioned her about whether she believed Zara's claims. Lila responded by saying that anything was possible in life, and Zara might not be able to have her own children. She suggested I consider getting a DNA paternity test. I asked if she had taken the test herself. Lila admitted that she had, and I pressed further, asking about the results and who the father was. She confessed that she didn't know the results because she hadn't looked at them. Lila explained that she didn't care about the test results, as the children were hers, even though she had given birth to them but hadn't raised them. She had no intention of giving them up to anyone. When she asked if I was interested, I replied firmly that I was not. Eventually, Regina and I divorced Lila, and she relinquished the responsibility of raising the children to me. In court, there was no contest regarding this arrangement. 6 months later, Regina and I got married, and I adopted Rose.
Alone in that club, surrounded by men with cruel intentions. Jane didn't have to say it, but I knew. Laura had been assaulted. When I got to the hospital, Jane was waiting for me. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying. But when she saw me, they filled with fury. "This is your fault," she spat. "You made her go alone. If you hadn't been so controlling, she wouldn't have been there by herself." "No," I stammered, shaking my head. "I didn't make her go. This isn't on me." But Jane wasn't listening. "You'll pay for this, Franklin," she said, her voice low and cold. "I'll make sure you regret every single thing you've ever done." Despite the ominous warning, the next part of the dream shifted. Somehow, we still got married. I didn't understand it, but there we were, standing at the altar, saying our vows. For a while, life seemed okay, peaceful, even. The fight stopped. Jane smiled more. We were happy, or so I thought. Then came the day at the hospital. Jane was in labor, and I was by her side, holding her hand, feeling a mix of excitement and terror. When the baby was born, the room fell silent. My heart stopped when I saw the child, a beautiful baby, but undeniably mixed race. I turned to Jane, my face pale. What is this? I asked, my voice shaking. Jane looked at me, a slow, wicked smile spreading across her face. And then she laughed. Not the light, musical laugh I'd fallen in love with, but a cold, mocking sound that sent chills down my spine. Welcome to your new life, Franklin. Your hell has just begun. The next thing I knew, I was back at the condo. On the kitchen counter were divorce papers, already signed by Jane. She'd claimed everything. The condo, the savings, even the investments I'd worked my entire career to build. Attached to the papers was a restraining order. I was being labeled as a domestic abuser. I tried to fight it, but the system was stacked against me. Word spread quickly, and soon, I lost my job. My colleagues avoided me, my friends stopped calling, and my reputation was in ruins. One day, as I sat in the wreckage of what used to be my life, I saw a photo online. Jane and Laura, sitting together on a beach somewhere, smiling. Laura raised a glass to the camera as if to toast my downfall. In that moment, the weight of everything crushed me. I screamed, the sound raw and broken, but no one was there to hear it. And then I woke up, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. The mushrooms had worn off, and reality came rushing back. It was just a dream, a terrible, twisted nightmare. But the feelings it left behind? Those were real. The anger, the fear, the guilt. I sat there in the dark, wondering if it was a warning. If my worst fears about Laura, about Jane, about everything, weren't just in my head after all. When I got home, the air felt thick, like something was off. And then I saw her, Laura, sitting on my couch, smirking like she owned the place. Jane was in the kitchen, pouring wine, acting like this was completely normal. Why is she here? I asked, my voice sharp but controlled. Jane turned, trying to look casual, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. Laura canceled her plans last night because of everything. So tonight she thought we could hang out. And we decided to go out. Just the two of us. I felt my stomach twist, but instead of letting the anger take over, I smiled. A calm, measured smile that even I didn't expect. You can go, I said simply. Both Jane and Laura froze, surprised by my reaction. Laura's smirk quickly returned, but there was a flicker of something else. Hesitation, maybe. Wow, she said, leaning back against the couch. I guess the boy finally knows his place. I didn't even flinch. Yes, I said, my voice steady, but I guess you still need to figure out yours. Her smirk faltered for just a moment, but she covered it up with a laugh. Whatever, she said, standing up and grabbing her bag. Come on, Jane. Let's go. Jane looked at me, her eyes searching mine for something. Approval, maybe? Or doubt. But I didn't give her anything. I just stood there, calm and collected, as they walked out the door. The sound of the door clicking shut echoed in the quiet apartment. I stood there for a moment, the smile fading from my face. Let them have their night, I thought. Let them feel like they've won. Because something inside me had shifted. I wasn't going to play this game anymore. But that didn't mean I wasn't planning my next move. The call came at midnight, jolting me out of a restless sleep. Jane's father's voice on the other end was frantic and shaky. Franklin, you need to come to the hospital. It's Jane and Laura. Something happened. I didn't ask questions. I just threw on my clothes and drove like a madman to the hospital. When I arrived, I found Jane's father pacing in the waiting room, his face pale and full of worry. She's in there, he said, pointing toward one of the rooms. They're both saying they were assaulted. My stomach churned, but something about his tone made me pause. It wasn't just worry, it was confusion. I stepped into the room, and there they were. Jane, lying on the hospital bed, looking pale and shaken, and Laura, sitting in a chair beside her, her usual smugness replaced with a thin veneer of distress. Jane, I said, my voice steady, but cold. What happened? Jane avoided my gaze, her hands fidgeting with the hospital blanket. Laura, on the other hand, perked up immediately, her eyes narrowing as she spoke. What happened? We were attacked, Franklin. This is exactly why I said Jane should never have trusted you. If you had been there... Stop, I said sharply, cutting her off. I turned to Jane's father, who looked like he was bracing for something. Mr. Clark, I appreciate your concern, but I'm here to tell you this. The wedding is off. I'll have Jane's clothes packed and sent to your place by morning. Jane's head snapped up, her face a mixture of shock and confusion. What? Franklin, you can't be serious. Laura jumped to her feet, her outrage immediate. You're running away because something bad happened to her? You're pathetic. I smiled bitterly, pulling my phone from my pocket. Oh, I'm not running. I just don't tolerate liars. I tapped the screen a few times and turned the phone toward them. The video played clearly, a security feed from a nearby hotel. It showed Jane and Laura walking arm in arm with a group of men, laughing and flirting as they entered the hotel lobby. An hour later, they emerged, still laughing, and hailed a cab. According to the doctors, I said, my voice low but cutting, there's no evidence of any assault. None. And now we both know why. Jane's face went pale, tears streaming down her cheeks. Franklin, it's not what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like, I interrupted. You and your best friend cooked up some story because you didn't want to face the consequences of your own actions. But I'm done. I don't marry liars. And I certainly don't marry someone who would disrespect me like this. Laura's face twisted into rage, but before she could say anything, I silenced her with a glare. You've done enough damage. To Jane. To me. But you won't get another second of my time. I turned on my heel and walked out of the room, leaving behind the sound of Jane sobbing and Laura sputtering in indignation. By the time I got to my car, I felt an odd sense of relief. It was over. Whatever spell Jane had over me was broken, and I could finally see clearly. Sometimes, the hardest decisions are the ones that set you free. It had been a few days since I'd walked out of that hospital, leaving Jane and Laura behind. The weight of everything still hung over me, but I was determined to move on. That night, as I walked back to my apartment from a late meeting, I felt the distinct sensation of being followed. I turned a corner into a dimly lit alley. Stupid, I know, but I wanted to confront whoever it was. That's when it happened. A man lunged at me, a knife glinting in his hand. Fortunately for him, I've been a black belt in judo for years, and muscle memory kicked in. With a quick sidestep and a well-placed throw, I disarmed him and pinned him to the ground. He squirmed beneath me, cursing and yelling, but I didn't let up. Who sent you? I demanded, my voice ice-cold. The man hesitated, his face twisting with a mix of anger and shame. Laura, he spat finally. She said you ruined her and Jane's life. Told me to teach you a lesson. My grip tightened. And you agreed to this, why? I'm her lover, he said, his words dripping with defiance. One of the guys from the hotel that night. Jane, Laura. Me? It wasn't what you think, man. We all had fun. Laura she wanted to get back at you after what you pulled. My stomach churned, but I kept my composure. You have proof of this? The man smirked, clearly proud of himself. Hell yeah. I got videos. Figured they might be useful someday. I yanked him to his feet, pushing him against the alley wall. Show me, I ordered. With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his gallery. Sure enough, there they were. Videos of Laura and Jane, laughing and drinking with him and his friends. The images turned more explicit, confirming everything I'd already suspected. I grabbed his phone and sent the files to myself before tossing it back to him. Get out of my sight, I said, my voice low and dangerous. He hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing his options, but the look in my eyes must have convinced him. He turned and bolted, leaving me standing alone in the alley, the weight of what I'd just uncovered settling over me. As I walked back to my apartment, my mind raced. I had the proof now, not just of their lies, but of their sheer malice. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it yet, but one thing was certain, this wasn't over. The next morning, I heard a knock at my door. I wasn't surprised when I opened it and found Jane standing there, her face a mix of defiance and desperation. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. We need to talk, she said sharply. Make it quick, I replied, leaning against the counter, my expression blank. She took a deep breath and launched into it. You need to marry me, Franklin. You owe me that. My child. I cut her off. Your child? Yes, she snapped. My child needs a father. You may not want to do the right thing, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't. I couldn't help but laugh, the sound bitter and cold. Let's not pretend this is about morality, Jane. You're looking for a meal ticket, not a father for your kid. But let's clear one thing up. If you're so sure this is my child, let's get a DNA test. Her face hardened. No, I'm not subjecting myself or my baby to your ridiculous accusations. Then I have my answer, I said, pushing off the counter. There's nothing more to discuss. Get out. Jane's demeanor shifted instantly, her voice dropping into a dangerous tone. You think you can just walk away from this, Franklin? If you don't marry me, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of man you are. I'll file assault charges. Harassment, abuse, whatever it takes. You might be able to fight the charges, but by the time it's over, your career, your reputation, all gone. I smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that caught her off guard. Without a word, I turned my laptop around so she could see the screen. Her expression changed from anger to confusion, then to horror as the video started to play. There she was, with Laura and the men from the hotel, clear as day, laughing, drinking, and eventually engaging in the kind of behavior she'd been so eager to lie about. You recorded this? She stammered. No, I said, my tone calm. Your boyfriend from that night was happy to share. But there's more. I clicked on another file, and the room was filled with her own voice, threatening me with false charges, spelling out her plan to ruin me if I didn't comply. Jane's face turned white as I opened an email draft on the screen. The files were attached, and the recipients were listed: her employer, her family, and the authorities. Let me show you how serious I am, I said, my finger hovering over the mouse. With one click, I sent the email, watching as the notification confirmed it had gone through. Jane's hands trembled as she stepped back, her voice barely a whisper. You can't do this. I leaned closer, my voice low and steady. Get out of here, Jane. Go fight the fire I just lit. And don't ever come near me again. She turned and stumbled out the door, her panic visible in every step. 2 days later, the nightmare I thought I had closed the door on came knocking, literally. Jane and Laura stood at my doorstep, faces set with anger and determination. Against my better judgment, I let them in, if only to avoid them causing a scene in the hallway. What do you want now? I asked, folding my arms and leaning against the door. Jane spoke first, her voice strained. You owe me, Franklin, for the time we spent together, for everything I gave up to be with you. I blinked at her in disbelief before a bitter laugh escaped my lips. Oh, you? Are you serious? Jane, are you a prostitute now? Because that's the only way this demand makes any sense. Her face flushed with shame, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the old Jane, the one who might have felt remorse or regret. But then she steeled herself. I deserve something for everything I went through. I shook my head, my patience wearing thin. You deserve exactly what you've earned, which is nothing from me. Now, both of you need to leave before I call the cops. Laura, as always, couldn't keep her mouth shut. She stepped forward, her voice rising. You think you're better than us? You're just a spineless man who hides behind his money. If you're not going to give Jane what she deserves, at least help me. I need a loan. That caught me off guard. A loan? You've got to be kidding me. Laura's tone shifted, desperate now. I'm in debt to someone dangerous. If I don't pay up, it's my life on the line. I stared at her, letting the silence stretch before replying. You don't know how to ask, do you? Her confusion turned to anger. What? If you want my help, you'll have to learn some humility, I said coldly. Laura hesitated, then slowly dropped to her knees, her face a mixture of fury and humiliation. Please, she said through gritted teeth, help me. I leaned down, meeting her eyes with a smirk. Now you know your place. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a $1 bill, and tossed it onto the floor in front of her. That's all you're worth. Take it and get out. Jane stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, as Laura's face twisted in rage. She lunged at me, her scream echoing through the room, but I was ready. I had already called the cops when I saw them approaching my door, and right on cue, there was a knock. The officers stepped in, separating Laura from me as she thrashed and shouted obscenities. Jane tried to defend her, but the officers weren't having it. After a brief explanation and a quick review of the security footage from my building, they placed both women in handcuffs. As they were led away, Jane turned to look at me, her eyes filled with a mix of betrayal and despair. This isn't over, Franklin, she spat. I stood in the doorway, watching as they disappeared down the hall. Oh, it's over, I muttered to myself, closing the door behind them. For the first time in weeks, my home felt peaceful again. A few days later, as I was heading home, something unexpected caught my attention. A pair of screams pierced the air, sharp and desperate. I turned my head to see two women being dragged by several men toward a car. One of the women, though I couldn't see her clearly at first, screamed Jane's name, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of her voice. That's my boyfriend. He'll give you the money. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I knew that voice. Without thinking, I stepped closer, trying to make sense of the scene. One of the men turned toward me, his face hardened with menace. Are you her boyfriend? He asked, his tone flat but dangerous. I stared at him for a moment, taking in the situation. Then, with a slight shrug, I answered, "Nope, never seen that woman." The man paused, then grinned, as if my response had been the punchline of a joke. "Well, then she's going to pay the right way." With that, they shoved Jane and the other woman into the back of the car, the engine roaring to life. The men climbed in, the car peeling away from the curb in a cloud of exhaust. I stood there for a moment, watching the car disappear around the corner, a strange mix of emotions swirling within me. I could have done something, maybe. I could have tried to intervene, tried to help, but the truth was, I felt nothing for Jane anymore, and the thought of getting tangled in her mess again made my stomach turn. Turning away from the street, I walked back to my apartment, the sound of the car fading into the distance. For the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The past was finally behind me, and I was done being dragged back into it. It was time to move on. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
I exposed my cheating wife's lies, took everything from her, and left her with nothing but regret. I reflected on the recent weeks, struggling to pinpoint any specific evidence that would suggest she was cheating. The sense of unease within me resulted from various small incidents accumulating, leaving me with an unsettling feeling. While I sensed something was amiss, I couldn't identify it precisely. Although I was fairly certain that something was happening, I lacked proof and details regarding who, what, or where it might be occurring. Doubts about my own sanity surfaced, questioning whether I was overreacting or imagining scenarios of her infidelity. Despite my uncertainty, my gut was in turmoil, indicating that something indeed was going on. It could be the early stages of a fling or affair, perhaps a one-time occurrence. Strangely, the more I dwelled on these thoughts, the more convinced I became. I'd been grappling with these concerns for what felt like weeks. But how long had the situation been unfolding before I became slightly aware that something was wrong? I took another sip of my JD, signaling the bartender, who nodded with a half-smile, having seen that troubled look many times before. Surveying the quiet bar filled with indistinct chatter, I noticed a lack of joy. The patrons had bland, unremarkable faces, all nondescript and average. The only woman in the place, in her 40s, possibly overdressed for the time and place, seemed a bit desperate, receiving drinks from an older guy. He appeared hopeful, though looking at her, he didn't need to try so hard, she already had his number. Other patrons were merely passing time while the rain outside fell, further dampening spirits. Soon, each would run out of reasons to stay in the sanctity of the bar and head homeward. I remained undecided about my course of action. I turned towards the voice, and there she was, looking at me with eyes that seemed to peer into my soul. As I attempted to respond, words eluded me. In the dimly lit bar, water dripping from her, Sammy started to remove her coat, and I questioned her presence. Curious, I asked why she was here. Sammy explained that she was worried about me, sensing that she would find me at the bar. She suggested we talk. I stared at her, wondering about her motives. Could I trust her? To steady myself, I took a sip of my JD and ordered her a vodka and soda. We waited for the bartender to move away before resuming our conversation, our eyes conveying uncertainty and a subtle struggle for dominance. Sammy pointed out that my recent behavior had caught her attention, sensing that I carried the weight of the world on my shoulders. I looked into her brown eyes but quickly averted my gaze. There was an unspoken understanding between us. I assured her that everything was okay between us, attempting to downplay the situation. However, she wasn't convinced. My heart sank as I realized my attempts to minimize the issue were futile. Placing her glass on the table, Sammy locked her fingers together, leaning slightly forward. She told me she knew what was going on. Confused, I feigned ignorance, but Sammy insisted. We moved to a booth for privacy, reluctantly agreeing. I asked her what she thought she knew, attempting to deflect the conversation. Sammy saw through my bluff, asserting that I couldn't lie to her after our long history. She encouraged me to talk, insisting that I needed someone to confide in. I'd known Sammy since she was 17. She was a constant presence and harbored a crush on me when I initially dated her sister Claire, who was 3 years older. Despite their differences, Sammy and I always got along, occasionally leading to sibling clashes with Claire. Over the years, Claire and I married after 2 years and settled into what I perceived as an ideal future. Both working in decent jobs, we earned enough for a comfortable life. Sammy, my sister-in-law, had enjoyed her late teens and early 22s and, at 25, sought a more mature phase in life. She had matured into someone any guy would be fortunate to be close to. Claire and I had been married for 5 years, with our anniversary due in another month. Contemplating whether we would make it that far, Sammy, an attractive woman and a friend besides my sister-in-law, looked at me with my eyes filling. Struggling to articulate my emotions while her resounding "I know" echoed in my mind. Sammy reached across the table, offering support. As her fingers gently stroked mine, I felt my heart slowly breaking. As she spoke, she mentioned that if I wouldn't say it, she believed she knew that Claire was cheating on me. Despite the shock of her words, I stubbornly tried to process what I knew and its implications. I resisted hearing more, convincing myself that if I didn't acknowledge it, it couldn't be happening, sparing me from the pain of confronting the truth. Sammy noticed my glassy-eyed expression and questioned whether it was shock or denial. She expressed her love for me and urged me to wake up, suggesting that it might be a misunderstanding. In response, I attempted to deflect her and continued deceiving myself. Sammy's eyes flashed with rage, and she exclaimed, drawing the bartender's attention. I assured the bartender that everything was fine. Sammy apologized, expressing her frustration with me and emphasizing her concern for my well-being. She urged me to wise up and face the reality of the situation, emphasizing that we needed to take action. I agreed to start, and Sammy shared her suspicions. She recounted an incident from a few weeks ago when she was with my partner and she received a call on her mobile. Sammy found it peculiar that Claire left the room to take the call, considering they were sisters. I nodded, feeling a sense of dread. Continuing her story, Sammy revealed that she checked Claire's phone, discovering there was no lock code. The call was from a guy, saved as Robert. Sammy didn't know any Robert or Bob but decided to monitor for any recurrence. I asked about the identity of this Robert or Bob guy, seeking clarification. After about a week, Sammy discovered the identity of the guy my partner had been messaging. He was someone she knew from years ago, before our relationship began. Apparently, they reconnected through social media or chat sites, and their messaging had been going on for a few weeks. I admitted that I had no knowledge of these interactions, only sensing that there were small things keeping us apart. Sammy acknowledged this but explained that it was all part of what they were doing, nothing overt, but it seemed like things were falling into place for them. Curious, I asked if it was just a couple of friends messaging each other, perhaps reminiscing about old times. Sammy confirmed that it started that way but hinted that something had changed. I was surprised and asked if I hadn't noticed anything suspicious. I mentioned that it felt like circumstances were conspiring to keep us apart, and there was an obvious lack of opportunity for any fun, too. Sammy stared at me incredulously, expressing a sense of disbelief. I returned her gaze, awaiting her next words. She urged me to pull my head out of the metaphorical sand, emphasizing her love for me. In response, I questioned the extent of the situation, seeking to understand how far it had gone. Sammy met my gaze, and her eyes briefly flickered, providing an unspoken confirmation. My anger began to simmer within me, prompting a quick barrage of questions about when, how, and where these encounters had taken place. Sammy shared that she knew my partner had met the other guy at least 3 times over the past 2 weeks. Initially unsure, Sammy only became certain 2 days ago that the situation had progressed. She had a lunch with one of her friends who worked with Claire, and some information slipped out during their conversation. Sammy discovered that Claire had met the guy twice for lunch and at least once for dinner the previous week. She asked if this aligned with what I had observed or suspected. I looked at her as I took in her words. There were a couple of times recently when I had called her office to arrange a lunchtime meet, and she wasn't there or had just gone out. Was that when she met him? Then last week she had that seminar thing she just had to attend. It was a late notice thing and arranged for after work. She had gotten home late that night, after 12. Thinking back, she had come in saying that it had dragged on, and the team had gone for a drink in the hotel bar to unwind before leaving. No love-making that night, I remember, and she hit the shower before bed too. My mind was racing, my brain scrambled as I took in these hurtful facts. Sammy expressed concern, telling me not to do anything reckless that could lead to legal trouble. I could sense the change in her expression as I made my decision. I declared my refusal to tolerate the situation any longer and vowed to put an end to it. I affirmed that I would not accept a cheating partner and was determined to make them both pay for their actions. Sammy cautioned me, advising against impulsive actions without a plan. Her words had a strange way of helping me calm down, confirming that my suspicions were indeed true. Seeking more information, I asked if she knew where my partner might be at that moment. Sammy confirmed that she believed my partner was currently with the other guy, explaining that it was the reason she sought me out. The rage resurfaced, prompting me to pound the table. People in the bar turned to look as I signaled the bartender. I asked Sammy if she knew the exact location. Sammy explained that she didn't know the exact location, but planned to speak with my partner the next day to gather more information. She mentioned that the other guy is married with a couple of kids, though she wasn't sure about his residence. She assured me that she would try to find out more to assist in the situation. I expressed gratitude, reaching for her hand and holding it tightly as I wiped away a tear from her cheek. I thanked her for her support, acknowledging the difficulty of the situation for her. Sammy, looking worried, asked about my plans. I assured her that I couldn't act on my impulses just yet, but intended to put an end to the situation definitively. I promised there would be consequences, without remorse, for both of them. In the meantime, I planned to secure what was rightfully mine and gather evidence for my next course of action. As I finished my JD, I signaled the bartender, slipping him a note and telling him to keep the change. Sammy continued to look concerned and asked when I planned to confront my partner. I considered the situation, planning to make some calls the next day while addressing my assets. I emphasized my determination not to give her a single penny. Sammy pointed out the difficulty of being around my partner, and I acknowledged that it had been challenging for the past few weeks. I believe that if she hadn't noticed any change by now, she likely wouldn't in the future. Sammy stood up, expressing her need to leave. I offered to talk again tomorrow, and she agreed, promising to find out more for me. She put on her coat, and I stood to help her, feeling her proximity. She resembled her sister so much as she looked up at me, tears in her eyes. I kissed her cheek, reassuring her that I would be fine. She smiled and left, disappearing into the dark and wet evening. Sitting back down, I took a deep breath, contemplating my next steps. One thing was clear in my mind: they would pay, and the retaliation would be swift, relentless, and unforgiving. Update: I don't recall much after that. Somehow, I woke up in my own bed with a mouth like the bottom of a parrot's cage. My head was still swimming as I raised it off the bed. Rolling over, I noticed I was alone and there was no sign of Claire. My senses slowly awakened as I heard noises from downstairs. Sliding my feet over the side of the bed, I tried to stand. Waking up the next morning, I couldn't help but wonder about the events of the previous night. As I staggered to the bathroom, attempting to shake off the grogginess, I proceeded to rouse myself. Entering the kitchen, I found her there, inquiring about the state I was in. In response to her question, I vaguely mentioned having a drink with an old friend and getting carried away. Sitting down, I poured some orange juice, drank it, and poured another. When she probed further, asking about the friend's identity, my mind started to work. I mentioned a guy named Bob, explaining that I knew him from way back and that he was in town for a couple of days on business. At the mention of Bob, I noticed a flicker of something on her face as she turned. I elaborated, recalling our college days and football years together. Claire seemed puzzled, unable to remember Bob. Nevertheless, she brushed it off, expressing indifference as long as I had fun. It was the first warning sign. Seated across from me at the table, I thought about my conversation with Sammy the previous night. I casually inquired about her activities the night before, feigning interest. I looked into her eyes as she lied about finishing work and going for a light meal and a drink with colleagues. She claimed to be home by 9:30, expressing concern for me due to a late meeting. I knew she wasn't home by then, as I was still at home until 10 p.m., deciding to head to the bar when enough was enough. That was the second warning sign. She continued, mentioning some tasks she needed to complete in the morning and hinting at being late in the evening. Bob, an old friend, was expected to be in touch, and they had plans to catch up. I suggested inviting Bob over, emphasizing the pleasure of reconnecting with old friends. She agreed and asked if I remembered him, using an endearing term. She stared at me with a neutral expression, attempting to conceal any reaction, but I sensed something beneath the surface. Despite her poker face, I could perceive a hint of emotion. I dismissed her inquiry about inviting Bob over, assuring her that I would manage on my own. I decided to get ready for the day, having more orange juice and a couple of painkillers before leaving the house, ensuring I didn't miss the opportunity to collect my car left at the bar. 30 minutes later, I departed, while Claire continued preparing for her day. As I dressed, I contemplated the situation, my determination growing. This couldn't continue for much longer. I clenched my fists, angered by the thought of Claire with Bob, vowing revenge. I harbored intense resentment towards him. The workday proved chaotic, with a constant stream of calls, dealing with issues on the line. My secretary handled some calls, but I couldn't avoid crucial meetings. The tension within me intensified as I navigated through the day, fueled by a growing desire for retribution. By mid-morning, the initial rush eased off, and I had some almost free time to deal with my personal issues. I closed my office door and started to check out my financials. Within 15 minutes, I had tightened the purse strings and moved some cash out of reach. I also arranged a meeting with a solicitor to discuss a possible divorce. I still had a few days before that, so my thinking was that it would give me time to get more information, not that it would matter that much anyway. But it could give me some leverage. Claire had her own bank account and credit card, so there was no need to do anything there. It was access to our joint account that was of concern, but I plugged that loophole quickly, so if it came to it, she couldn't get any more than what was left. My own account was secure and only had a smallish balance. The rest was shifted out and safe. We had no children, so essentially it would be a straightforward split should it come to that. I had decided in my own mind that we could only get over this if Claire were to confess her sins, so to speak, and seek forgiveness. Any kind of reticence there, and we were done. That thought made me feel sad. I sat at my desk in silence as I mulled over what had transpired and the actions I had taken so far. Today, I needed more information on the Bob character and evidence, or would the fact that I knew about it be enough to really duck the two of them over? The phone interrupted my thoughts, and it was Sammy on the line. I shared that I was occupied with various thoughts and plans but had initiated some actions. Sammy provided additional information about the guy, Bob Stones, revealing that he was married. She had his address and workplace, obtained discreetly through her friend who had seen Claire with him. According to Sammy, they seemed to be growing closer despite attempts to conceal it. Acknowledging the start of potential evidence, I requested Bob's details from Sammy. Within minutes, I located his social media page and obtained a photo. Something about his face seemed familiar, triggering a vague memory. Despite the unsettling feeling, I decided to call Claire around lunchtime, intending to stir the container. During the call, Claire explained she had a meeting with a client named Mr. Stones, which added another layer to the situation. Suppressing my emotions, I kept the conversation casual, though her mention of Mr. Stones felt like a taunt. Strike three, I thought, determined to take swift and merciless action against both of them. Ending the call, I masked my anger, promising to see her later and enduring her declaration of love with a clenched jaw. After ending the call, my anger boiled within me. Seated there, I clenched my teeth, contemplating the unsettling revelation. My secretary appeared, poking her head into the office, offering to grab something from the deli down the street. Considering for a moment, I instructed her to surprise me with something substantial, hearty, and rich in red meat, something to sink my teeth into. She gave me a peculiar look but nodded, closing the door behind her, sensing that my behavior had been unusual all morning. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. Sammy visited her sister's office and noticed Claire leaving the elevator alongside a tall, dark-haired man, roughly around 30 years old, Bob Stones. The man Sammy had identified from his online photo. Stepping in front of her sister, Sammy surprised Claire, who seemed uneasy about her plans being disrupted. Sammy explained her impromptu visit, expressing a desire to see her sister and possibly go for lunch. Claire, visibly uncomfortable, mentioned that she and Mr. Stones were having a business lunch and suggested meeting another time. Mr. Stones introduced himself, and Sammy, feigning innocence, asked how long he had known Claire. The question seemed to catch him off guard, and Claire hurriedly pulled him away, citing a meeting they needed to attend. As they left the building and entered a waiting cab, Sammy smiled, observing her sister looking back at her as they drove away. I sat in my office, munching through a massive sub filled with red meat, smiling to myself as I nodded at it slowly, savoring it while contemplating my next steps. Sammy had confirmed that Claire had left her office, so she called her secretary and found out she would be out all afternoon. Well, isn't that just ducking great? Everything was set regarding my finances, and I had a locksmith on speed dial with the terms prearranged. My solicitor was primed and ready to act as soon as I provided him with the remaining information he had requested. Okay, tonight was going to be the first stage. I was going to really mess with the pair of them for a little while before I pulled the trigger. My old man always told me, don't let them know you're coming for them, just take Route 1, be direct and destroy the bastards. A man of few, if not direct, words. Maybe that was something I had forgotten recently, but it was coming, it was on its way. Update that evening at home, Claire walked in, appearing normal, and nothing seemed out of place until I detected a faint scent of men's cologne. As I went to kiss her, she noticed my reaction, and without verbalizing anything, I gave her a light kiss on the cheek and made my way to the door. Curious, she inquired about my plans, asking if everything was okay. I assured her that I was fine but had a matter to attend to. I explained that I was heading to Jerry's place for a poker game with a few colleagues from work, hoping it would be a good distraction. Closing the door behind me, I got into my car and left the driveway, grinding my teeth in frustration. Upon arriving at Jerry's, I parked outside and entered his garage. Jerry, a longtime friend with a history of dealing with the police, had combat training, making him the ideal companion for what I had in mind. He was a substantial figure, a friend since school, and I had called him earlier to seek his assistance. He readily offered his support without asking questions. This kind of unwavering support was exactly what I needed. We quickly slipped into the garage and I changed into a pair of dark overalls with a matching ski mask. We looked like two mime artists standing in silence. No words were exchanged as we got into a nondescript, second-hand car. Jerry had obtained nothing remarkable or noticeable about it. Cruising slowly across town to the address Sammy had given me, still no words passed between us. We had agreed on the format before, so there was no need for further discussion. Jerry parked the car outside Bob Stone's home, and there was no sign of life, with just one visible light. We waited in silence. As the front door opened, we saw him step out, get into his car, and ease down the road. Jerry followed at a safe distance. We already knew his destination, so there was no rush or panic. Parking at the driving range posed no problem, and we stayed in the car. The radio played in the background as we sat, watching and waiting. The tension inside me was almost unbearable, making it challenging to stay still. The urge to step out and walk around was strong, but we knew it was risky. Gradually, the car park emptied until only a couple of other cars remained. Both of us tensed as we observed him making his way to his car. Jerry got out and stealthily approached the target. Afterwards, I drove us out of the car park quietly, without drawing attention. Jerry remarked on the success of the operation as he removed his gloves and mask. I expressed gratitude, acknowledging that I appreciated his assistance. Jerry assured me not to worry, stating that he owed me and could never fully repay me for what I had done for him. I reminded him that friends help each other and pointed out that at least his hands weren't injured, and there was no CCTV in the car park. We considered the job well done. Deciding to head back, Jerry suggested starting a card game with the others, who would be there by now. We drove back, spending the next 4 hours playing poker for fun. The atmosphere among the guys was positive, and they understood the situation, providing the support I needed, boosting my confidence for the upcoming confrontation with Claire. However, before addressing the main issue, I planned to play some mind games with her. I stumbled through the door just after 1 a.m., intentionally exaggerating the amount I had to drink. Jerry had arranged for one of the guys to drop off my car. Claire, waiting up, questioned my lateness and examined me closely. I dismissed her concern, mentioning that Jerry and the guys had dropped me off in my car, admitting to having a bit too much JD. Disregarding my jacket and missing the coat pegs, I slumped onto the sofa and looked at her. Claire, with crossed arms and a disgusted expression, sat there. I maintained a blank expression, waiting for her to speak. She couldn't hold back and finally asked, "What is going on, Steve? Is there someone else or something? You're acting really weird lately." I chuckled, suppressing the anger building within me, reminding myself to take it easy. "I'm all right, my petal. Just been through a rough patch recently. It'll all be over soon." My words lingered in Claire's mind, leaving her unsure but sensing something amiss. We went to bed, and I pretended to collapse, feigning immediate sleep. It irked her, as she seemed ready for a confrontation, but I refused to engage. The following morning, Claire was the first to rise, making coffee. I descended the stairs, acting obnoxious, pretending to have a hangover. Playfully entering the kitchen, I greeted her and mentioned my throbbing head. She tossed a headache remedy my way. As I sipped my coffee, she appeared subdued, and I noticed her phone on the kitchen table. Wondering if she had received any calls, Claire noticed my gaze on her phone, and I could sense her desire to reach for it, although doing so would seem odd. Pouring more orange juice, I casually picked up the phone. A look of panic flashed across her face as I intercepted a message. I briefly glanced at it before sliding the phone back to her, stating that it needed charging to avoid a flat battery and any missed messages. Leaving the kitchen, I went to get dressed, leaving Claire looking after me with a sense that something was amiss. She wondered if I could know, dismissing the thought as she believed she had been careful. Their involvement had only been going on for a few weeks' lunches, dinner 3 times, and hotel stays 3 times. She considered it nothing more than fun, confident that I would never find out, especially since I wasn't going without. The revelation led her to contemplate her recent intimacy with her husband, unable to recall the last time. She pondered if her neglect might have contributed to my suspicions. Hastily descending the stairs, I swiftly exited the door, sidestepping Claire's attempt for a more passionate farewell. Waving and smiling, I pulled out of the driveway and headed to work. Around 11 a.m., I decided to send Claire a text for amusement, expressing regrets for the day and explaining that there was a lot on my mind, assuring her it would soon be resolved. I settled back, awaiting a reaction. Later in the day, Sammy visited me, inquiring about what had happened. I questioned Sammy about her earlier statement, asking her what she meant. Earlier in the day, an employee from the golf club had found Bob Stones in the trunk of his car, badly beaten. Claire had informed Sammy, and she was shaken. Sammy asked if I had done it, and I responded that I didn't care too much either way, denying any involvement. I went on to mention that Claire had told me she found out about Bob's condition through a scheduled meeting with him. His company had called, stating he was in the hospital and his wife had called them. Sammy found my explanation cute and plausible, but suggested that maybe next time it wouldn't be so easy for them. I was asked about my cryptic remark, and I replied, saying that accidents happen in the strangest places. That night, upon arriving home, Claire was absent, and her car was gone. There was no message. Irritated, I called her phone, cheerfully inquiring about her whereabouts. She responded, explaining that she was at the hospital visiting a friend, assuring me it wouldn't be long. I expressed my hope for her friend's swift recovery, bid her goodbye, and hung up before she could respond. 30 minutes later, she returned, looking drained. I asked about her friend's condition, expressing my hope that it wasn't too serious. Claire hesitated before responding, mentioning that it was nothing too dramatic. Her friend had just fallen and would be home in a few days. I suggested coffee, and she accepted, thanking me. While sipping her coffee, Claire brought up an incident at her workplace, mentioning that one of her company's reps had been assaulted the other night. I reacted with surprise, asking for details. She explained that he was attacked and left in his car overnight, but reassured me that he was okay. Bob wasn't hurt too badly, and it seemed like they wanted to mess him up for no reason. Nothing was stolen or anything. I couldn't help but think about the contradiction, given my prior denial of knowing Bob. Update: she noticed me looking at her and realized she had made a mistake. She tried to cover it up, but she knew it was too late. Now he was aware of the situation as well. Quickly, she hurried to make an exit to change. I suspected she would be on the phone any second, but to whom? I decided I needed to reassess my plan. Since things were escalating, I had to move things forward a bit. Calling upstairs to Claire, I informed her I needed to go out for a little while, reassuring her I wouldn't be long. I drove to Bob Stones' home address and knocked on the door. A petite, dark-haired woman opened the door. I explained that I was Steve Ryland, and my wife, Claire Ryland, had dealings with her husband. She looked at me nervously, yet intrigued. I requested to come in for a moment. In the lounge, she realized the gravity of the situation as I mentioned the affair between Claire and her husband. I expressed my regret for having to break the news and informed her that he was currently in the hospital. She folded inwardly, tears flowing for a few seconds, expressing her suspicions. She mentioned that she knew he was at it again and decided to divorce him. She felt that Claire had enough chances to come clean and the lies were unbearable. Unsure of how long the affair had been going on, she was convinced of Claire's betrayal. When I inquired about the incident the other night, she admitted uncertainty. I clarified that I didn't lay a finger on him and expressed my shock at the situation, indicating my lack of concern about whoever damaged him. I mentioned that I couldn't be sorry about it. I questioned if he might have been involved with another man's wife, to which she responded, "Nothing surprises me." She decided to keep him out of her life, emphasizing that they had moved back to the area because he was fooling around before. Before leaving, I provided her with my locksmith's and solicitor's contact information. Realizing the complexity of the situation as I drove slowly home, I focused on dealing with the other half of my problem. My inner rage was under control, understanding that once retribution began, it would run its course of action I would follow and relish for the most part. The end of my marriage saddened me, but I knew there was no going back from her betrayal. My one consolation was that the parties that caused me pain would experience it in far greater measure. I do not forgive. Update: I guided my car onto the driveway, noticing Claire's car exactly where she had left it just a couple of hours ago. Absent-mindedly tapping the bonnet as I passed, I approached my front door and slid my key into the lock. A heavy feeling settled in my heart, realizing this might be the last time I do this as a married man. Stepping inside, the weight of the recent worries pressed on my shoulders, making them incredibly heavy as I slowly moved towards the lounge. The murmur of the television greeted me as I neared the doorway. There, perched on the sofa, was Claire, her demeanor radiating fear and trepidation. A sense that something was amiss hung in the air, as if the game was up without a word being spoken. Nervously, she shook, trying to maintain composure. I stood silently watching her, and as our eyes met, I saw fear and attempt to speak, but nothing escaped her lips. Walking into the room, I passed her to fix myself a drink, remaining silent. I reached for my drink, my unblinking eyes locked onto hers. She waited, sensing something was amiss. My expression remained impassive as I observed the woman I had deeply loved, now balancing those feelings with the pain she had needlessly caused me. It was time for her to feel my pain. As I stared, she detected no reason for optimism in my face. Pulling herself together, Claire straightened up, deciding to brazen it out. Unaware of what I knew, she couldn't endure the incriminating silence any longer. She asked where I had been, and frustration crept into her voice at my silent treatment. I responded, saying that I would tell her where I went if she told me where she had been. Uncertainty flickered in her eyes as she insisted she was at the hospital visiting a friend. I maintained a blank expression and fear flashed across her eyes. She was rattled. Once again, she deflected the question back to me, thinking she had skillfully batted it away. I told her to stop the nonsense and explained that I visited a friend myself, someone I hadn't known for long. Our conversation was crucial, and although I hadn't met her before, we were now friends of sorts. I had an enlightening talk with her about her husband, Bob Stones, asking if she had heard of him. Her face flushed as I toyed with her emotions. I explained that I needed to talk to the Stones woman about her husband's infidelity, having discovered his affair. In response to my revelation, she offered concern, asking if I was okay and offering to get me a drink. I inquired about her knowledge of Bob Stones' affairs, watching her struggle to find words. I took the lead, telling her that I knew about her involvement with Bob and had known for a while. I challenged her to speak up before leaving, emphasizing that it didn't mean anything and was just closeness. I scoffed at her excuses, reminding her of the vows we both took. As she continued to defend herself, I called her out, expressing my frustration with her lies. I pointed out that she treated me like a fool, and her attempts to downplay the affair infuriated me. I sarcastically commented on the claim that it only happened twice, and questioned whether it was worth our marriage. She apologized, claiming it didn't mean anything, and expressing a willingness to make it up to me. I laughed bitterly, accusing her of being sorry for getting caught and questioning whether she would have stopped if not exposed. I asserted that all the lies she told had become second nature, and only she believed them. I told her that she was not the woman I fell in love with and married. She looked at me as the weight of my hurt started to penetrate her cheater's facade. She realized the seriousness of the situation and asked what she could do, promising to do anything. I informed her that we were done and called Sammy, letting her know about the situation. Sammy would be arriving shortly to pick her up. Claire, shocked, asked where she would go, and I responded harshly, saying she could go wherever she liked, even back to the hospital to see her boyfriend. He didn't care. We were done. Claire sat stunned as there was a knock on the door. I greeted Sammy and told her to get Claire out of here. I explained that if she didn't leave, I was afraid of what I might do to her. Despite hating what she had done, I still cared about her, but it was time for her to go. Sammy hurriedly gathered Claire's things for the next few days. I thanked Sammy for her assistance and mentioned that I would be in contact soon. As Sammy prepared Claire to leave, I listened to the sound of my wife sobbing. Sammy swiftly packed Claire's belongings into a couple of suitcases, and in less than 10 minutes she was removed from my home. The real challenge would be to get her out of my life permanently and erase the pain. Retribution would help with that. Staring into the flames of the pyre I had built in the backyard, I watched everything of Claire's go up in flames. There was no way I would allow her back into my house for anything.